Have you ever wondered what humanity would look like if we never learned to speak? No stories, no names, no history, no empires, no religion, no science, no civilization as we know it, just silence, gesture, instinct, and a species forever trapped inside the present moment. Tonight, we step into that lost timeline and explore how different the human world would become if language never existed at all. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, the world is quiet in a way that modern people would barely recognize as human. Dawn breaks over tall grass and broken woodland, over riverbanks silver with mist, over clusters of dark figures already awake before the sun fully clears the horizon. They move carefully through the cold light, watching one another, watching the trees, watching the horizon where large animals pass like weather. A child stumbles near the edge of a slope and a woman turns instantly, arm out, face tightened, mouth opening in a sharp sound that means alarm without ever becoming a word. A man points toward tracks pressed into wet earth. Another tilts his head, studies the marks, and answers with a short burst of breath, a click of tongue, a narrowed gaze. Meaning passes between them, but only just enough. It is immediate, physical, rooted in the body like balance or fear. Nothing here can be named, nothing can be explained, nothing can be carried very far beyond the moment in which it is seen. And yet these are humans, or near enough to the humans that eventually become us. They are social, observant, inventive in flashes, capable of attachment, jealousy, tenderness, grief. They recognize faces, infer moods, remember paths, anticipate danger. They know the habits of prey and the moods of weather better than any city dweller ever will. They comfort infants, protect the injured when they can, and sometimes linger beside the dead in ways that suggest memory is beginning to deepen into something heavier. But in this world, one thing never truly arrives. The long chain of sound and symbol that, in our own history, binds one mind to another never crosses the threshold into language. Speech remains stranded on the near side of possibility, trapped among cries, gestures, rhythms, expressions, and practical signals. Communication exists, of course. No human group could survive without it. But it never becomes the endlessly generative system that allows a species to speak of absent things, impossible things, yesterday, tomorrow, gods, numbers, laws, or dreams. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, to imagine such a world properly, it helps to begin not with what language does at its highest level, but with what life looks like before any of that can happen. The first humans do not step into a silent void. They inherit a rich animal repertoire. Apes already gesture. Monkeys give distinct calls for different predators. Wolves coordinate. Birds warn, attract, and defend through patterned sound. Even among living great apes, communication is more sophisticated than people once assumed. Chimpanzees combine posture, gaze, touch, and vocalization in ways that clearly matter. Bonobos negotiate social tension with remarkable sensitivity. Gorillas signal intention and mood. So the question is not whether our ancestors can communicate without language. They absolutely can. The deeper question is what happens if they never pass the point where communication becomes symbolic, recursive, and open-ended enough to build civilization. At first, perhaps, the difference is not dramatic. Small groups can do a surprising amount through shared attention alone. If everyone knows the same valley, the same nesting trees, the same stream that shrinks in dry months and floods in wet ones, then pointing, miming, and emotional sounds go a long way. A mother can teach a child to crack nuts by placing a stone in the child's hands and repeating the motion again and again. A hunter can signal caution with posture long before prey notices movement. An elder can show where roots grow after rain, which berries sicken, which pools keep water when others fail. Much of the earliest human world is practical and visible. The body can demonstrate what the mouth cannot explain. This matters because it prevents the thought experiment from becoming absurd. A speechless humanity is not a species of helpless innocence wandering toward immediate extinction. They would still be formidable animals, cooperative primates with dexterous hands, forward-looking eyes, unusual endurance, and an enormous talent for reading social cues. They could still laugh in some bodily sense, still mourn in some bodily sense, still fear betrayal and crave belonging. The evidence from both anthropology and primatology suggests that social intelligence runs deep beneath language. Humans do not invent empathy from scratch by speaking. They bring powerful emotional machinery with them into the world. What language eventually does is amplify, refine, and preserve that machinery at a scale nature never achieved before. Without that amplification, life remains radically local. A warning can mean snake, but not the snake that was here yesterday when the river was lower and the child wandered too far. A gesture can mean come, stop, look, give, danger, food, me, you, perhaps even there or again. But there is a threshold beyond which demonstration fails. One cannot easily mime the cause of an illness, or describe a place beyond the ridge no one else has seen, or explain why a trap should be built in anticipation of an animal that migrates only twice each year. Some of this can be approximated through repetition and shared experience. Some of it cannot. Meaning keeps collapsing back into the immediate environment, into what eyes can see and bodies can enact. That creates a different kind of human time. In our own world, even the simplest conversation lifts people out of the present. Words allow a mind to travel. They make absence manageable. A person can speak of a dead parent, a distant water source, a season not yet arrived, a plan no one has seen, a spirit no one has proved, a promise that may be broken months from now. Language stretches the horizon of thought far beyond the visible scene. Without it, the future grows shorter. The past grows thinner, not because memory disappears, but because memory becomes harder to organize, rehearse, and pass on. A thing remembered by one body is trapped there unless it can be shown again in action. And action depends on circumstance. If the season changes, the lesson may vanish with it. This is where the world begins to narrow, not physically, perhaps. These humans still roam forests, coasts, plains, and uplands. They still adapt to climate zones. They still use fire if they discover how to tend it, though even firekeeping becomes far more precarious when instructions cannot be fully verbalized. But the invisible world narrows the world of categories, stories, imagined causes, hypothetical dangers, social rules, and accumulated explanation. Scholars still debate exactly how thought and language interact, and the evidence remains incomplete, especially when we try to project backward into deep prehistory. Some cognitive scientists argue that many forms of thought can exist without language. Visual reasoning, spatial navigation, emotional judgment, and practical problem-solving clearly do. but what survives in the record suggests that language transforms thought by giving it scaffolding. It stabilizes ideas long enough to compare, combine, and refine them. Remove that scaffolding and human intelligence remains real but much less cumulative. There is another subtle change, easy to miss at first. In a wordless human world, individuality becomes harder to preserve beyond direct familiarity. In our world, names are small miracles. They allow a person to remain socially present even when absent. They attach identity to memory, responsibility, inheritance, praise, blame, reputation. Without names, recognition depends more on the face, the body, the moment. Within a small band, that may be enough. Everyone knows everyone. But beyond that small circle, social knowledge decays rapidly. The stranger is not the man from the eastern marsh who once traded shells for meat and returned after the long rains. The stranger is only this body, here now, carrying whatever immediate signs can be read. Trust becomes more fragile because reputation has nowhere durable to live. So the first great consequence of a humanity without language is not silence in the literal sense. It is the shrinking of continuity between minds, between generations, between one season and the next, between one band and another, between what is known now and what might be known later. A languageless species still has sound, still has memory, still has culture in the thinnest sense of repeated habit, but it lacks the engine that turns habit into history. The landscape around these early humans reflects that limit. A shelter may be used for years, then abandoned after a harsh season. A tool shape may improve slightly, then stagnate. A useful trick may appear in one valley and never spread beyond it. A child may discover that a certain stone fractures into a sharper edge, but unless others see it, repeat it, and preserve the pattern, the insight dies almost at once. In our own history, the rise of language means that one mind does not have to begin where another began. Knowledge can move, survive, and accumulate. Here it leaks constantly back into the ground. Even emotions unfold differently. Love survives, but not love poetry. Grief survives, but not the stories that keep the dead among the living. Fear survives, but not the myths that organize fear into a cosmos. There may still be ritualized behavior. Bodies often ritualize before minds explain. Rhythmic movement, repeated burial acts, shared attention towards sky, fire, bones, or caves could still appear. But the symbolic density remains limited. No chant encodes ancestry. No tale binds the group to an origin. No formal instruction tells the young what the stars are supposed to mean. If symbolism emerges at all, it does so in fragile fragments, difficult to standardize and easy to lose. And this is the strange thing from a distance. Such beings might still look very much like us. They gather, they gesture, they cooperate, they care for children, they prepare food, they scan the horizon with the same anxious intelligence. They may even decorate a body, prefer one place over another, react to death with visible disturbance. An outside observer, watching from afar, might feel they are on the verge of becoming fully human in the familiar sense, but the threshold never breaks. The neural and social conditions that, in our own world, produce grammar, symbolic reference, and speech never fully lock into place, whether because of anatomy, cognition, social environment, or simple evolutionary contingency. The spark remains partial. So humanity begins and remains in a kind of permanent near miss. The species has enough mind to sense possibility, enough cooperation to persist, enough ingenuity to survive, but not enough language to escape the prison of the immediate. The hands are already human. The eyes are already human. The hunger, the rivalry, the tenderness, the dread of the dark are all recognizably human. What is missing is the bridge. One mind can reach toward another, but never deeply enough to build the invisible structures that outlast flesh. The quiet of this world is not peaceful. It is full of signals, movement, breath, warning, effort, and need. But all of it vanishes almost as soon as it appears. Nothing settles into a sentence. Nothing becomes a shared abstraction. Nothing can be stored in the air and carried intact into another century. And because of that, the entire future of the species changes before history even has a chance to begin. Inside the skull, the change is harder to see, but it is even more profound. A human being without language does not simply speak less. That person inhabits a different architecture of thought. The world still arrives in colours, movements, textures, threats, faces, and remembered roots. Hunger still sharpens attention. Fear still narrows the field. Affection still binds one body to another. A hand still reaches for a useful stone before the mind fully explains why. But when language never emerges, thought remains tied much more tightly to what can be sensed, repeated, and enacted. It can move, but not with the same reach. It can combine impressions, but not hold them together for long in the kind of stable, manipulable form that words make possible. This does not mean that prelinguistic humans become mindless creatures drifting through instinct alone. That would be far too simple, and the science does not support it. Long before language in its modern form, hominins are already capable of planning to some degree, reading intentions, remembering locations, and making tools that require sequencing rather than random action. Even living animals with no language in the human sense can solve problems, anticipate outcomes, deceive rivals, mourn losses, and navigate complex social hierarchies. Crows use tools, octopuses improvise, chimpanzees can store short-term goals and adjust tactics in real time. Human cognition would still exceed most of the animal world in flexibility and social awareness. But the evidence suggests that language does something unusual. It makes certain kinds of thought easier to stabilize, rehearse, and combine across time. Take something as simple as the idea of tomorrow. In a speaking world, tomorrow is not just a feeling of delay. It becomes a concept that can be held, revisited, attached to plans, compared with yesterday, and divided into parts. A person can think, tomorrow we go to the bend in the river after the sun clears the trees, because last time the herd turned there after the rain. Strip away language, and some anticipation remains. A person can remember a pattern and move toward it. They can be restless before a seasonal event, return to a place when fruit usually ripens, feel caution near a den where predators once slept. But the inner handling of time becomes less precise. It is less likely to crystallize into explicit, revisable sequences. One can act on expectation without being able to narrate the expectation to oneself or others. This is one of the great hidden powers of language. It allows thought to become an object of thought. A person can take an impression, label it, return to it, and manipulate it. The mind is no longer forced to keep every complex relation alive through sensation alone. Words act like hooks. They hang ideas in mental space long enough for comparison. A hunter in our world can think not only of a wounded animal, but of the category of wounded animals, the likely behavior of such animals in certain terrain, the memory of similar pursuits, and the possibility that a companion may misread the tracks. Language makes it easier to nest one thought inside another. Without it, cognition may still be sharp, but it is more fleeting and more dependent on immediate cues. Numbers offer another revealing example. In the modern world, even people with little formal education live inside verbal and symbolic counting systems so deeply that it is hard to imagine thought without them. But exact number beyond very small quantities is not automatic. Some traditional societies with limited number vocabularies show that human beings can function well with approximate quantities while struggling with exact arithmetic once numbers move beyond a few distinct values. That does not mean they are less intelligent. It means symbolic structure matters. In a world where language never develops, humans might still distinguish one from many, few from many, perhaps even track small groups by perception. But the leap to formal quantity, debt, measurement, calendar reckoning, or engineering ratio becomes far harder. The evidence remains incomplete on how much abstraction can arise without verbal scaffolding. But no single explanation fully accounts for complex mathematical thought appearing in the absence of stable symbolic language. The same is true of categories. Modern humans do not merely see trees, they see kinds of trees, useful trees, sacred trees, trees that burn hot, trees that mark the edge of old land, trees associated with stories, seasons, ancestors, medicines. Language lets categories accumulate layers. It lets one thing belong to several systems at once. Without words, categories still exist in some practical sense. One can treat this plant as edible, that one as dangerous. One can recognize familiar faces and unfamiliar ones. One can respond differently to juveniles and adults, to dominant individuals and weak ones. But the categories remain looser, more situational, harder to refine deliberately. A person may know a thing by feel and use, yet still be unable to combine that knowledge flexibly with other kinds of knowledge when a new problem appears. That affects selfhood as well. It is fashionable in some popular discussions to imagine an inner voice as the essence of consciousness. But the truth is more complicated. Not everyone thinks in the same way, and not all thought is verbal. Images, sensations, emotional states, and non-verbal intuitions all matter. Still, language profoundly shapes how humans organize the self over time. It allows autobiographical memory to become narratively structured. It allows a person to tell themselves who they have been, what they intend, what they regret, what they fear becoming. In a languageless humanity, the self may remain more immediate, more embodied, less stretched across a coherent internal story. People would still remember. They would still feel shame, pride, attachment, and loss. But their memories would likely be more episodic and less easily woven into long explanatory chains. That matters because narrative is not just decoration. It is one of the main ways human beings coordinate action, justify rules, endure suffering, and imagine futures. A person who cannot tell a story even silently to themselves lives in a thinner temporal field. A hardship is a hardship, but it is not easily framed as sacrifice for a later goal. A death is a rupture, but it is not easily integrated into a lineage or a cosmic order. A repeated event is recognized, but not necessarily transformed into a formal lesson that can be consciously generalized and transmitted. Scholars still debate the exact degree to which inner speech is necessary for self-reflection, but what survives in the record suggests that rich symbolic language expands not only communication, but the felt continuity of personhood itself. Problem-solving also changes in subtle but important ways. humans without language could still solve many immediate problems extremely well. In fact, they might appear highly competent in domains where perception, motor skill, and environmental familiarity matter more than abstract deliberation. They could climb, throw, track, hide, discriminate among materials, and improvise with admirable precision. A person who has opened shells or cracked bones 1,000 times does not need a sentence to do it. Repetition trains the body. Practice becomes memory in the muscles. But when the problem is novel, multi-step and detached from the present scene, the ceiling lowers. It becomes harder to think through a chain like this. The rains failed. The animals shifted. The old crossing dried. So next season we should remain near the stone ridge and store more of the bitter roots because the children weakened last time. Some of that reasoning could exist as association, yet without language. Holding the whole chain steady enough to analyze and share becomes much harder. This is why cumulative culture remains so fragile in such a world. Intelligence is present, but it does not stack easily. A clever individual may stumble upon a useful trick, but the trick is difficult to formalize. Others can imitate the visible surface, yet miss the hidden condition that made it work. In our own history, language allows a teacher to point beyond the act itself. Not just do this, but do this because the stone flakes better from this angle, because the wood splits differently after drying, because the animal turns downhill when wounded in the abdomen. Explanation preserves causation. Without it, imitation preserves only appearance, and appearance is a much weaker teacher. There is a lesser-known clue to this in the archaeological record of early technology. Many stone tool traditions remain stable for immense periods of time. Hand axes and other forms can persist, with surprisingly little change over hundreds of thousands of years. Scholars argue about why. Perhaps such tools were already effective enough. Perhaps innovation is risky. Perhaps populations were too sparse. But one plausible factor is that cumulative refinement depends not just on cleverness, but on high-fidelity transmission. If techniques cannot be explained precisely, then small improvements die out or spread very slowly. Even in our own world, where language eventually appears, technological change is often far slower than modern people expect. In a world where language never emerges, that inertia becomes one of the defining facts of the species. And then there is imagination. Humans are imaginative before language, but language gives imagination structure. It allows impossible things to be assembled from real parts, a hunt not yet attempted, a place never seen, a being made of memory and fear, a rule that exists only because everyone agrees it does. Without language, fantasy in the full human sense contracts. Dreaming still exists. Visual recombination still exists. Fear can still misread shadows. But the ability to build complex shared fictions, and thereby organize collective behavior around invisible ideas, remains stunted. No one can convincingly invent an ancestor spirit who protects a boundary, or a law that applies to all members of a group whether or not anyone is watching, or a social debt that survives the death of the lender. These are linguistic achievements before they are political or religious ones. The mind, then, becomes intensely skilled in the near field and weak in the far field. It is alert, sensitive, adaptive, often intelligent in ways modern people underestimate. But it struggles to project itself across time, to stabilize abstractions, to arrange memories into doctrine, to compare hypothetical worlds, to calculate the unseen. This does not eliminate humanity. It changes its scale. These people are still human enough to suffer from limits they cannot name. They can sense patterns without being able to formalize them. They can feel the burden of memory without fully externalizing it. They can cooperate, but only within a narrow band of shared perception. The result is a species whose greatest organ never quite becomes what it could have been. The brain is large, social, hungry for order, but language never arrives to unlock its most cumulative mode. A silence settles not over the mouth alone, but over the deepest architecture of abstraction. Thoughts rise and fade like tracks in dust after wind. Insight flashes, but rarely hardens into doctrine. Experience shapes behavior, but seldom becomes theory. And so even before villages fail to form, before history fails to accumulate, before science and law and myth never come into being, the first great loss has already happened in secret. It has happened in the shape of thought itself. By the time the sun is high, the group has already spread and gathered twice. A child trails behind an older female, copying the way she presses a digging stick into damp soil, twists, lifts, and checks the roots by smell before placing them into a skin sling. Nearby, an adolescent watches two men worrying at the remains of a broken branch where bees once nested, studying not the sweetness itself but the sequence that led to it, the smoke, the waiting, the careful hand, the sudden retreat when stings came too thick. Nothing is explained in the way modern people would recognize as explanation. There is no sentence to mark the difference between safe and unsafe, between now and later, between almost ripe and not yet, between this method and the one that failed in another season. There is only attention, repetition, interruption, correction by gesture, approval by proximity, disapproval by tone. Family exists here with all its warmth and all its limits. Care is abundant as precision is not. This is where a speechless humanity becomes most recognizable and most strange. The tenderness remains familiar. Adults still shield infants instinctively from cold, falling, hunger, and sharp things. Children still learn by hovering close, by imitating hands and faces, by absorbing the rhythms of a group that moves together because separation is dangerous. The bond between parent and child may be as intense as anything in later history. In fact, it may have to be. Where nothing can be fully verbalized, patience and repetition become the main infrastructure of survival. Teaching is not a lecture, it is prolonged exposure. It is watching the same action dozens, then hundreds of times, until the body stores what the mouth never can. That gives childhood a different texture. In our own world, children are immersed almost immediately in verbal worlds far larger than their own experience. They hear warnings before they understand danger, names before they understand categories, stories before they understand time. They're told what happened yesterday, what may happen tomorrow, what belongs to whom, who they are descended from, why certain things are forbidden, and what invisible meanings sit behind visible acts. In this alternate world, none of that can be laid over the child like a second skin. Learning remains local, sensory, and situational. A child knows what fire does by heat, pain, fascination, and careful supervised nearness. A child knows who comforts, who threatens, who shares, who strikes. A child may know roots, shelters, and useful plants through constant exposure, but knowledge cannot leap ahead of direct encounter very easily. This means that even within loving families, misunderstanding is constant. A mother can urgently signal that a snake is dangerous. She can pull a child back, make a sharp sound, imitate the striking motion, point to the place, perhaps even show a scar. That is enough for immediate caution, but she cannot easily explain the difference between one kind of snake and another unless the child sees that difference repeatedly in practice. She cannot give a generalized lesson about hidden danger in dry grass after rain, or connect the lesson to another animal with similar behavior, or explain why a swollen limb after a bite matters more than the bite itself. What survives in the record suggests that nonverbal teaching can be powerful, but it depends heavily on context. Remove the context, and much of the meaning evaporates. The consequences are larger than they first appear. Family, in human history, is not only a unit of affection, it is also the first archive. Parents do not simply feed children, they load them with maps, expectations, taboos, techniques, and stories. Grandparents extend the archive further, preserving seasonal memory that no single young adult could accumulate alone. In a world without language, this archive still exists, but in a painfully unstable form. It lives in routines rather than narratives, in repeated demonstrations rather than explicit instruction. A grandmother may know, in her body, that the shellfish are dangerous when a certain bloom colours the water or when heat lingers too long over the shallows. But unless younger people witness the pattern under the right conditions, that knowledge may die unused. There is no reliable way to say not now. Wait until the water clears. Remember the sickness from the hot season 3 floods ago. Memory is present as transfer is weak. This makes families more dependent on continuity of environment. In our world, language allows people to detach knowledge from the exact place in which it was learned. A lesson from one valley can be retold in another. A memory of drought can shape behavior years later, even after landscapes change. Here, lessons remain tied to scene and gesture. When families move, much of their knowledge becomes harder to preserve because it has never been converted into portable symbolic form. A child raised beside a coast may become highly skilled at reading tides, shell beds, and seabird behavior. But if that child later ends up inland after famine or conflict, much of what was learned may be only dimly adaptable. It was never turned into general principle. It was learned as a dance with one specific world. Affection itself also changes under these conditions, though not in any simple or cold direction. Without language, love is less declared and more enacted. It lives in food handed over, wounds cleaned, bodies gathered close against night cold, dangers intercepted before the young understand them. Grief too becomes intensely physical. The dead can be touched, carried, watched, perhaps revisited at places where bodies or bones remain. Some form of mourning almost certainly persists because attachment does not require words. Many animals display responses to death that are difficult to dismiss as mere reflex. Humans, with their stronger memory and deeper dependency, would likely do so even more intensely. But grief cannot be narrated into lineage. A child cannot be told in rich detail who the dead person was before the child was old enough to know them. There are no formal recollections. No stories that rescue personality from disappearance. The body is remembered while direct memory lasts, then fades much faster into absence. That fading has enormous social effects. In spoken cultures, elders become more than just experienced individuals. They become living repositories of events no one else remembers. They can compare seasons, recall conflicts, explain kinship, identify obligations, warn against old mistakes, and preserve techniques that are no longer used every year. In a wordless family, elders still matter deeply because their bodies hold more practiced responses than anyone else's. They may notice signs others miss. They may be calmer in crisis. They may know by feel where water is likely to remain or how smoke behaves in damp wind. But their knowledge is harder to extract except in the moment of use. the group benefits from their presence, yet cannot harvest the full content of their experience in portable form. When an elder dies, far more vanishes than later humans would consider tolerable. Children, meanwhile, become astonishing mimics because they have to be. Imitation becomes not a supplement to teaching but its backbone. This would likely sharpen observational learning to remarkable levels. Subtle hand positions, facial cues, and bodily timing would carry immense importance. A young person who fails to attend closely may miss life-preserving details no one can later spell out. In such a world, human eyes might become even more specialized in reading intention from movement. Scholars still debate how much this sort of pressure could reshape cognition over evolutionary time, but it is plausible that social attention, gesture sensitivity, and memory for action sequences would become especially refined. Yet even that adaptation would not fully solve the central problem. Copying is not the same as understanding. It preserves behavior better than it preserves reasons, and reasons matter most when circumstances change. A family can teach a child how to do what has always been done under familiar conditions, but when drought shifts the migration routes, when a new predator enters the area, when illness spreads in an unfamiliar pattern, when a plant once safe becomes scarce, and substitutes must be tried, imitation reaches its limit. Modern humans can respond by discussing alternatives, comparing remembered outcomes, testing hypotheses verbally, and passing provisional conclusions onward. Here, families must improvise in near silence with only gesture, shared attention, and rapidly decaying memory to guide them. Some groups survive such turns, others do not. No single explanation fully accounts for why some lineages endure and others disappear, but weak information transfer would make every environmental shock more punishing. There is another quieter consequence. Morality remains present, but diffuse. Parents can reward sharing, punish dangerous selfishness, signal approval or disgust, and establish recurring patterns of tolerated and forbidden behavior. Children can clearly learn that some actions bring comfort and closeness, while others bring threat or exclusion. Social emotions do a great deal of work even without language. Fairness in some rudimentary sense may emerge naturally in small groups because blatant theft, aggression, or neglect damages cooperation. But moral rules stay bound to situation and relationship. There is no easy way to turn repeated expectations into explicit norms detached from the immediate people involved. A child can feel that one does not strike an infant or seize food from the injured, but cannot be told a generalized principle that applies across unknown future cases. Ethics remains embodied custom, not articulated code. This also reshapes pair bonds and parenting roles. Long-term cooperation between adults is still possible and likely necessary, especially given the unusually prolonged helplessness of human children. A species with large brains and slow development cannot thrive without extensive care, so partnerships, alliances among relatives, and shared parenting probably remain central. But their terms are fragile. Jealousy, conflict, favoritism, and exclusion still occur, yet cannot be negotiated through explanation, apology, or agreed future conditions in the ways later humans take for granted. Reconciliation must happen through gesture, offering, submission, avoidance, or renewed cooperation in action. This may work surprisingly often in small familiar groups. Among primates, much social repair already functions this way. Still, complex grievances would linger in a fog of partial understanding. Over generations, the family becomes both humanity's greatest strength and one of its sharpest limits. It keeps the species alive when nothing else can. It is the first shelter, the first classroom, the first field hospital, the first line of defense, the first source of belonging. But because it cannot become a true narrative institution, it cannot carry knowledge very far. It cannot reliably transform ancestors into history, habit into doctrine, observation into theory. Every family becomes a tiny island of skill surrounded by forgetfulness. What one household learns about a river crossing, a poisonous root, a stubborn ember technique, or a seasonal wound treatment may remain trapped there, and even there only so long as the right bodies keep repeating the right acts under the right conditions. From a distance, the scene can still look tender, even noble. At dusk, the group gathers again. Food is divided with all the subtle tension and cooperation that mark social primates. The smallest are fed first by some adults, pushed aside by others. A child leans into a sleeping body for warmth. An older hand adjusts a younger one on a stone flake, correcting grip without comment. In the dark, eyes remain alert to the sounds beyond the firelight or whatever passes for guarded shelter. It feels like the beginning of culture, and in a thin sense it is. But it never thickens into inheritance the way it does in our world. Families love, teach, protect, and lose one another. What they cannot do is tell the full story of what they know, and because they cannot tell it, almost everything they are forced to learn remains one death away from vanishing. Out on the open ground, the limits of this world become brutally clear. A group fans out along the edge of scrub and stone, every movement deliberate, every pause loaded with meaning that never quite reaches the level of speech. One person crouches and touches the earth where a hoof has pressed into damp soil. Another scans the ridgeline. A third shifts sideways, making a small cutting motion with the hand, then points toward a narrowing gully where an animal might be turned. For a few moments, it almost looks seamless. Bodies adjust to one another with the quiet competence of long familiarity. They have done this before, many times. They know the terrain, they know the prey, they know each other's habits well enough to predict the next few seconds. In that narrow window, a hunt without language can work. This is important to admit because otherwise the thought experiment becomes too simple. Cooperative hunting does not begin with grammar. Wolves bring down large prey without words. Lions coordinate by movement and position. Chimpanzees can hunt monkeys with role differentiation that looks, at times, uncomfortably close to strategy. Early humans, with better throwing ability, stronger long-distance tracking skills, and more flexible hands, could accomplish a great deal through mutual attention alone. A lifted chin, a frozen posture, a hissed warning, a stone tapped softly against another stone, a hand circling downward to signal crouching, an urgent wave to close distance. All of this could sustain surprisingly effective short-range coordination. The body can carry a great deal of tactical meaning when the group is small and the task is familiar. But hunting and gathering are not only about the moment of action. They depend on layers of inference, memory, timing, and revision. That is where the cracks widen. A person may be able to signal that a herd is moving uphill. It is much harder to communicate that the herd changed route this season because the lower marsh dried early, and that a similar shift happened once before after a harsh wind pattern, so it would be wiser to wait near the northern pass at dawn rather than pursue now. Some of that can be embodied in habit if the same people have shared the same cycles for years. Yet the more complex the situation becomes, the more communication collapses back toward the immediate and visible. This group can coordinate a chase. It struggles to coordinate a strategy. Gathering food reveals the same pattern in slower form. In a speechless human world, foraging remains one of the species' greatest strengths, because much of it can be learned by place, smell, texture, season, and repetition. A person can know where tubers grow after rain, when shellfish are easiest to collect, which fruiting trees draw birds, and which bark strips cleanly for fibre. The range of possible signals is wide enough to sustain daily subsistence in stable conditions. Pointing, imitation, disapproval, approval, repeated route following, and shared routines all carry real weight. What they cannot easily do is preserve subtle conditional knowledge. The difference between a plant that nourishes when boiled and poisons when eaten raw is exactly the kind of thing language handles well. Without language, the lesson must be demonstrated again and again, under the right circumstances, until the action itself becomes memory. If those circumstances fail to repeat, the lesson becomes vulnerable. This makes experimentation dangerous. In our own world, humans can test, compare, warn, and revise. One person can say the berries caused vomiting in 2 children last warm season, but only when taken from the low wet ground, not from the rocky slope. Another can disagree, another can add detail, and soon the group has a rough theory. It may still be wrong, but it is no longer trapped in one nervous system. In the wordless world, bad outcomes remain much harder to analyze collectively. A food source sickens someone. The group may react with avoidance, fear, disgust, or one person's remembered caution. But no one can easily lay out competing causes. Was it the ripeness, the place, the time of day, the contamination, the storage, the combination with something else? Scholars still debate how much causal reasoning can occur without language, but what survives in the record suggests that explanation at this level becomes far less stable once it cannot be verbalized and compared. Hunting in particular punishes these limits because hunting is full of uncertainty. Weather shifts, wind betrays position, wounded animals veer unexpectedly. One person sees tracks that another misreads. A predator may already be stalking the same prey. A successful pursuit often depends on coordination that unfolds over minutes or hours, not seconds. Here the body begins to fail as a communication system. Gesture works best within line of sight. Vocal calls work best when simple. Complex tactical revision at distance becomes nearly impossible. A runner cannot easily tell companions that the antelope doubled back behind the ridge where the ground hardens, leaving only faint sign near the thorn scrub. He can only call, signal, or physically redirect them if they're close enough to see. By the time the message reaches the group at all, the opportunity may be gone. This would likely push many human groups towards safer and more local food strategies whenever possible. Scavenging, trapping in simple forms, shoreline collecting, root digging, small game capture, and opportunistic hunting may dominate over the kinds of highly coordinated large prey strategies that, in our own history, help bind communities and drive innovation. Persistence hunting might still occur in limited settings because it relies heavily on endurance and tracking rather than elaborate verbal planning. But even that demands a degree of shared intention and route anticipation that is hard to sustain across multiple participants. The evidence remains incomplete because even our best archaeological interpretations cannot directly show the full communication systems of early humans. But a species without language would almost certainly favor subsistence methods that minimize the need for complex explanation. And yet there is a cruel irony here. Humans remain just intelligent enough to sense the edge of better coordination. A hunter can see that the others did not understand in time. A gatherer can sense that a mistake was repeated because the warning never fully transferred. A mother can watch a child imitate the wrong step and correct it too late. Frustration becomes one of the defining emotional textures of such a species. Not the modern frustration of failed eloquence, but something older and more bodily, the repeated experience of almost getting a meaning across, almost preserving an insight, almost aligning several minds around a hidden pattern. The species would live with permanent partial understanding. This also affects danger response. In a language-rich world, an encounter with a predator can become future policy. One attack on a riverbank can alter how children are watched there for years. One night raid by a big cat can change sleeping arrangements, fire placement, guard rotation, route choice, and teaching practices. In the speechless world, some of these adaptations still happen, but they are harder to maintain unless danger is frequent enough to etch itself into routine. Rare threats become especially difficult. If a crocodile takes someone from a crossing used only a few times each season, the event may be remembered intensely by witnesses, yet future group members who were not there cannot receive the lesson in full. The memory sits inside bodies, gestures, moods, and avoidance behavior, but it does not become a formal warning detached from direct experience. One lesser-known lesson from ethnography and cognitive science is that much traditional ecological knowledge is astonishingly detailed, but it is often carried in stories, names, classifications, songs, taboos, and ritual instructions as much as in observation alone. Modern people sometimes underestimate how much speech supports survival in non-industrial settings. A landscape is not just looked at, it is narrated. Place names store hazard and history. Seasonal rounds are encoded in verbal traditions. Resource rules are reinforced through custom and memory. Remove all of that, and even a highly attentive human group becomes poorer in usable information than the environment itself would allow. The land remains full of clues. The species loses part of its ability to hold them together. The same narrowing applies to cooperation during scarcity. When food runs short, people need not only effort but coordination of sacrifice. Who eats first, who travels, who stays with the very young, whether to split the group, whether to risk moving into another band's territory, whether to consume seed stock or preserve it, if such stock exists at all. These decisions require trust and foresight. They often require people to endure immediate loss for delayed collective benefit. Without language, such arrangements are much harder to negotiate. A dominant individual may simply seize more, others may submit, resist, or withdraw. Some patterns of sharing can still evolve because kinship and interdependence encourage them, but the more strained the situation becomes, the more fragile nonverbal cooperation grows. This likely keeps group size small. A hunting party of 5 or 6 closely familiar individuals can manage silent cues. A band of 20 can survive through routine. Beyond that, coordination costs rise sharply. The invisible glue that language provides clarification, planning, justification, memory, reassurance never fully forms. And since hunting and gathering are the main engines of daily life, that limit on coordination becomes a limit on society itself. A species unable to talk its way through uncertainty becomes a species that must live close to the edge of what can be directly shown. There may still be brilliance in flashes. Someone devises a better way to flush animals toward a bottleneck. Someone notices that shellfish are safest after certain tides. Someone experiments with carrying embers in bark or dung to move fire more reliably. Someone learns to read vulture behavior as a sign of carcasses beyond the ridge. These are real achievements, but each one survives only if bodies can witness it often enough to imitate it accurately. There is no easy method for saying why it works, when it fails, how it should be modified elsewhere, or who first discovered it. Knowledge does not travel far from performance. So the hunt continues, and the gathering continues, and humanity remains alive but strangely confined. People still feed one another. They still cooperate enough to endure. They still read wind and soil and water with a sensitivity that would astonish later ages. But every action occurs under a ceiling. The ceiling is not intelligence in the crude sense. It is transmissible complexity. A species can be clever, observant, and social, yet still remain trapped if it cannot preserve and refine collective understanding. Out in the grass and scrub, among hoofprints, roots, blood, smoke, and the endless labour of staying alive, that trap reveals itself every day. The group understands enough to keep moving. It never understands enough together to move very far beyond survival. What one person learns in this world is always in danger of dying alone. That is the central weakness now beginning to shape everything else. A woman discovers, perhaps by accident, that a certain bitter root becomes edible only after prolonged soaking. A man notices that green wood laid above a low, smoky fire dries into something stronger and less likely to split when shaped later. An elder, after surviving enough seasons to see patterns others have not, comes to recognize that the animals move earlier when dry winds arrive before the first heavy clouds. None of these are small insights. In a speaking world, any one of them could become the seed of a broader tradition, repeated, refined, and handed on until it turns into reliable knowledge. Here, each remains terribly vulnerable. Unless it is embedded in visible routine and repeated often enough for younger bodies to absorb it, it flickers for a while and then goes out. This is where the great promise of the human species begins to fail in earnest. The brain is already capable of more than the environment immediately demands. Hands can shape, eyes can compare, memory can hold surprisingly detailed impressions. Social life can preserve habits across years, perhaps even across generations in the narrow sense that children grow up doing what adults around them do. But cumulative culture depends on more than repetition. It depends on accuracy, explanation, correction, and extension. It requires that a useful act survive being transferred from one person to another without losing the crucial detail that made it useful in the first place. Then it requires that someone else add to it rather than merely repeat it. Without language, both steps become fragile. Archaeology gives us a muted version of this problem even in our own world. Some early tool traditions remain astonishingly stable for immense periods of time. A stone shape appears, works well enough, and then changes only slightly across spans so long that modern people struggle to imagine them. Scholars still debate why human technological change can be so slow under certain conditions. Population density matters, risk matters, environment matters. But one of the strongest ideas is that innovation does not thrive unless knowledge can be transmitted with enough fidelity to preserve subtle improvements. A sharper edge means little if the method that produced it cannot be reliably taught. In a world where language never emerges, that bottleneck becomes far tighter. Human life would be full of good ideas that never quite become traditions. Even fire, one of the most transformative forces in human history, becomes unstable under such conditions. A group can keep a fire alive through routine. They can feed it, carry embers, learn from repeated exposure which woods burn hot, which smoke heavily, which catch quickly. Much of this can be shown. But fire mastery is not one thing. It is a whole chain of linked practices ignition, maintenance, transport, placement, fuel management, safety, cooking, light, defense, warmth, perhaps even landscape shaping. Some of those can become habitual, others remain difficult to preserve and less frequently used. If a group loses fire during a wet season, or moves into an unfamiliar environment with different fuel conditions, regaining it may be much harder than in a speaking world. There is no detailed verbal troubleshooting, no explanation of hidden causes, no stored instruction detached from the experienced body. A species could live with fire for long periods and still repeatedly fall back from full control. The same is true of medicine. If that word can even be used at this stage, people would still discover soothing leaves, useful clays, pressure points for bleeding, ways of cleaning wounds with smoke or water, perhaps even crude splints or protective wrappings. Human beings are observant enough to notice what helps. Many animals already self-medicate in rudimentary ways, but to turn observation into durable practice requires more than luck. It requires distinguishing correlation from cause, remembering dosages and contexts, warning against mistakes, and transmitting the difference between one plant and another when appearances deceive. In a languageless humanity, care exists, experimentation exists, and some local remedies survive. Yet the archive remains weak. A treatment that saves one season may vanish the next if the knowledgeable individual dies, migrates, or simply cannot demonstrate the practice often enough. This makes progress feel almost haunted. The species is always close to accumulating knowledge, and yet so much of it drains away. A useful knotting method for binding branches appears in one sheltering site, but after a harsh winter disperses the group, no one reproduces it exactly. Someone learns how to shape a better point for fishing in shallow water, but the next generation copies the outline while missing the precise balance that made it effective. Another discovers that certain stones fracture most predictably only after heating near coals, a remarkable insight if true. But the evidence never becomes portable doctrine. What survives in the record suggests that early humans in our own past already walked a fine line between innovation and loss. Remove language entirely, and loss becomes the normal state. There is also a cruel asymmetry here. Damage spreads easily. Knowledge does not. A bad habit can be copied at once because it is visible. Panic can spread instantly because it rides on emotion. Injury teaches fast because pain is direct. But a subtle advantage often requires careful preservation of conditions. The stronger trap, the safer preparation method, the better season to move camp, the less obvious route to water in drought. These are exactly the things that disappear when communication is shallow. A species trapped in such a system does not remain static because nothing new ever happens. It remains static because new things fail to survive long enough to stack. The death of skilled individuals becomes one of the most devastating events in human life. Far beyond the immediate emotional loss, in all societies, the death of experts matters. But language softens the blow. A teacher may die after years of passing knowledge onward. Records may exist, apprentices may explain what they learned, others may preserve fragments. Here, when a particularly capable tracker, gatherer, firekeeper, toolmaker, or healer dies, a whole library burns with no smoke. Their hands knew things their mouths could never make durable. Their habits may linger in those who watch them closely, but the deeper pattern often vanishes. The evidence remains incomplete. Yet this is one of the most likely consequences of a speechless humanity, extreme dependency on living exemplars. This would likely change social behavior around age and skill. Groups might become intensely attentive to experienced individuals, not because they can deliver lectures, but because proximity itself becomes the main path to learning. Younger members may shadow elders constantly. Skilled adults become not just useful, but essential nodes in fragile chains of survival. Some traditions may evolve around imitation of the most competent bodies rather than formal roles or titles. Prestige, if it exists in a recognizable form, attaches less to narrated reputation and more to visibly repeated success. Still, even high prestige cannot solve the transmission problem. Admiration helps attention, but attention alone cannot preserve everything. One lesser-known insight from cultural evolution research is that human societies do not advance simply because individuals are smart. They advance because populations become systems for storing and filtering knowledge. Even many useful technologies in recent historical societies depended on specialists who could not fully explain every step scientifically, but could still transmit procedures through language, apprenticeship, notation, and institutions. Once those systems become dense enough, civilization acquires memory outside any single skull. In this alternate world, that external memory never properly forms. Culture remains alive, but thin. It is a skin stretched over the present, not a deep reservoir accumulating beneath it. This means setbacks are frequent and often invisible in the long view. A group may become excellent at exploiting a coast for several generations, then lose access to it through storm damage, conflict, or shifting shorelines, and with that move lose techniques that never become adaptable elsewhere. Another may become highly efficient in cold uplands, reading snow, tracking herd movement, conserving fuel. But after a sequence of milder years, the routines blur and the old hard-won knowledge decays. In a speaking species, even partial memory of past environments can be preserved in stories, warning tales, technical instruction, and place-link traditions. Here, environmental memory is much more perishable. When conditions change, knowledge often dies before it can become strategy. This constant resetting would shape evolution itself. Natural selection does not favor intelligence in the abstract. It favors traits that improve survival under actual conditions. If language never emerges, then what gets rewarded may be not the capacity for ever richer symbolic thought, but the capacity for close observation, procedural mimicry, patience, emotional attunement, and memory for repeated action sequences. Humans might become even better at learning by watching and doing. Gesture could become richer. Attention to minor bodily cues could sharpen. Yet these improvements would still circle around the same barrier. They would make skill transmission better than in other animals, but still far weaker than the linguistic inheritance that transformed real human history. The psychological effect of all this is difficult to prove, but easy to imagine. Groups would live with a vague, recurring sense of fragility. Useful things happen, then they stop happening. Good seasons are followed by failures no one can fully explain. A method works in one place and not in another, and the reason remains half seen. The old know more than the young, but much of what they know cannot be extracted except in the moment of action. The dead leave behind objects, roots, gestures, and perhaps favoured places, but not fully recoverable instructions. Knowledge has weight in this world, but no lasting container. By now, the future of the species is beginning to narrow in a recognizable way. The problem is no longer only that language is absent from the hunt, the family, or the mind. The problem is that without language, discovery has almost no safe place to live. Every advance must be reborn through demonstration. Every subtlety must survive in the body. Every generation begins not from zero, but from something only slightly better than zero, because so much of the past cannot be securely carried forward. That is a devastating condition for a creature whose greatest strength, in our own world, is precisely the opposite. And so progress does occur, but it behaves like a footprint near water. It appears, holds for a moment, and then softens at the edges. Another footprint lands nearby, not quite in the same place. Then another. There is movement, certainly. There is adaptation, insight, even flashes of brilliance. But there is no stable road. Humanity keeps learning, and keeps forgetting, and keeps paying again for lessons already purchased in blood. In a language-rich world, memory can outlast bodies. Here, memory remains mostly flesh-bound. When the flesh fails, the world becomes new again in the worst possible sense. Once knowledge can no longer travel far beyond the living body, something else fails to appear almost by default, the long-remembered past. The dead still matter in this world. Their loss still tears open the group. A body gone still leaves an absence that changes the shape of daily life, changes sleeping positions, changes who carries, who watches, who knows the path to water or the safest way to approach a bluff in crosswind. But absence is not the same as ancestry. Memory remains strong while the face can still be pictured, while the smell, the gait, the pressure of a hand on a shoulder can still be felt in the nervous system of those who knew them. After that, the person thins rapidly into something far less stable. There are no names to hold them in place, no stories to carry them across generations, no formal recitations to say who descended from whom, who wronged whom, who taught whom, who first found the sheltered cave after the great storm, or who was buried beyond the bend in the river when the air was still hot and the insects thick. This is where human history, in the deepest sense, never begins. Events still happen, of course. Storms destroy shelter. Predators take the unwary. One valley feeds people well for several seasons. Another fails. A child survives against expectation. A skilled elder dies too soon. A group splits after conflict. Another vanishes in drought. The world is full of lived events. What never forms is a durable chain linking those events into shared memory beyond the witness generation. There is no true history because there is no reliable vessel for history. There are only fading impressions attached to places, gestures, and habits that become harder to interpret with each passing season. In our own world, even the earliest myth does far more than entertain. It stores orientation. It explains why a hill matters, why a spring is avoided, why a boundary is respected, why one animal is treated differently from another, why the dead are handled in a certain way. Myth braids memory with meaning. It does not need to be factually accurate in the modern sense to be socially powerful. It preserves lineage, identity, and warning. It binds the present to an imagined past and therefore makes a future possible. Remove language, and that entire layer of civilization collapses before it can form. A place may still feel important because something happened there, because bones were left there, because danger once arrived there. But the importance cannot be narrated in a stable collective form. It lingers as mood, avoidance, attraction, repeated movement. Symbolic density never builds. Burial, if it appears at all, would therefore mean something different. Archaeologists have long debated when burial becomes intentionally symbolic rather than merely practical or emotional. The evidence remains incomplete, and many famous claims are more uncertain than popular retelling suggest. But what survives in the record hints that treatment of the dead can begin before fully modern symbolic systems are in place. Bodies might be covered, protected from scavengers, revisited, or placed in specific locations because the survivors feel attachment, aversion, caution, or some early sense that death requires response. In a speechless humanity, such practices could still arise. A mother may refuse to abandon the body of a child immediately. A group may shelter bones in a cave recess. Individuals may return to a place where one of their own died. Yet these acts would struggle to accumulate into explicit mortuary tradition. There is no recited ancestor list, no spoken cosmology of the afterlife, no formal explanation of what death means. Ritual might exist. Narrative almost certainly does not. That distinction matters more than it seems. Ritual without language can persist as repeated action, a body placed a certain way, fire kept nearby, stones arranged, silence or stillness held, perhaps even pigment used if habit and attention sustain it. But narrative is what transforms repeated acts into a remembered system. It is what allows one generation to say this is how it was done before, and this is why. Without that why, practices become brittle. They may continue for a while through imitation, then vanish when conditions shift or when the people who embodied them die. A speechless species might therefore leave occasional traces that later observers could mistake for symbolic tradition, while in reality those traces belong to fragile local habits with little long-range continuity. The same is true of origin. Human beings in our own world almost cannot resist explaining where they came from. Mountains are made by beings, rivers by ancestors, peoples by migrations, animals by transformations, stars by stories, even when explanations differ wildly. The impulse is astonishingly consistent. It turns a group into something more than a cluster of currently living bodies. It gives them temporal depth. It lets children inherit not just food strategies and body techniques, but belonging. In this alternate world, belonging remains immediate and social rather than historical. You belong because these are the bodies you move with, the hands that fed you, the faces you know, the dominant individuals you avoid, the infants you protect. But you do not belong to a narrated people stretching backward into remembered time. There is no people in that fuller sense. There is only the current band and its fading penumbra of older presences. This would radically limit identity. Modern humans carry several identities at once: family, clan, tribe, village, religion, profession, nation, language group, civilization. Most of those are made possible by symbols and stories that extend beyond direct acquaintance. In a language-less humanity, identity remains intensely local. One may distinguish familiar bodies from strangers, kin from non-kin, habitual allies from unpredictable outsiders. One may even feel strong attachment to a recurring place or movement pattern, but a group cannot easily become an abstract collective with deep temporal continuity. It cannot say we've always lived here, or we come from the red cliffs beyond the long river, or we descend from the ones who crossed the water. What survives in the record suggests that such statements are foundational to later human social scaling. Without them, society remains shallow in time even when it is emotionally intense in the present. Art, too, changes under this pressure. Humans might still scratch marks, arrange objects, decorate bodies, or prefer symmetry and pattern. None of that requires full language, visual attraction, play, display, and repetition are older than speech. But art without narrative remains constrained. It may evoke, attract, warn, or mark attention, yet it cannot easily serve as a long-lasting symbolic archive unless there is an interpretive system shared beyond the immediate moment. A handprint on stone in our world can become part of a ritual complex, a statement of presence, lineage, territory, or cosmology. In the speechless world, a mark might still be made, but its meaning is far less likely to survive separation from the maker. The mark does not enter a verbal web. It remains isolated, suggestive, and fragile. There is a lesser-known lesson here from undeciphered scripts and lost symbolic systems. Even in literate civilizations, once the chain of interpretation breaks, meaning can become maddeningly difficult to recover. A sign alone is not enough. It needs a community of use. It needs convention, repetition, explanation. If that is true even for full writing systems, how much more fragile would meaning be in a humanity that never reaches language at all? Symbols may appear, but they will often fail to become stable institutions. They cannot be anchored by shared narrative, so they drift or disappear. No myths also means no sacred law in the usual sense. There may still be taboos rooted in disgust, fear, or repeated habit. Some places may be avoided. Some foods may be associated with danger. Certain acts around the dead or the injured may become customary. But these are not backed by spoken accounts of supernatural sanction, ancestral precedent, or cosmic order. They remain socially enforced habits rather than articulated moral universes. That does not make them weak in every instance. Habit can be powerful. Emotion can police behavior effectively within small groups. Yet the absence of sacred narrative prevents norms from becoming deeply portable and self-reinforcing. They do not travel far, and they do not harden into systems that can outlast disruption. Perhaps the strangest consequence is how little the present would know of itself. Modern humans are surrounded by echoes. Even people who know almost nothing of formal history still live inside inherited stories about where they came from and what came before. A speechless humanity would live almost without echoes. Landscapes would contain traces, old hearths, worn paths, bones, broken tools, perhaps recurring camps used by unknown predecessors, but those traces would rarely become legible history. A child might play beside the remains of lives it cannot imagine. An adult might feel unease in a cave used generations earlier without knowing why. The species would inhabit ruins almost without understanding the concept of ruins. Scholars still debate how early symbolic behavior emerged in real human history, and no single explanation fully accounts for the sudden richness seen in some archaeological horizons compared with others. Population size, ecology, cognition, and social exchange all matter, but nearly all serious explanations assume one underlying force. Language allows symbolic material to become shared, repeated, and interpretable across time. Remove that force, and the long human conversation with the past never begins. There is no mythic memory of a flood, no ancestor tale preserving migration, no chant encoding a law, no sacred sequence linking burial to cosmology, no story explaining why a people endures. So the dead go silent much faster than in our world, not silent in the emotional sense. For a while they remain painfully present in the nervous systems of the living, but they do not survive the way later humans survive as names, roles, examples, warnings, beloved figures in recurring speech. They pass through grief into obscurity with brutal speed, and because that happens again and again, each generation lives in a world strangely cut loose from those before it. Customs exist without origins, places matter without explanations, habits persist without doctrine. The human species still accumulates scars, but not memory. That leaves civilization without one of its deepest foundations. A people that cannot tell itself where it came from cannot build much of a future beyond the next few seasons. The present remains crowded with effort, danger, care, and adaptation. But behind it, where our own species built ancestral time, sacred beginnings, and the first long bridges of historical consciousness, there is mostly dark, not emptiness exactly, more like a constant erasure. Lives happen, bodies disappear, traces remain, meaning does not. The settlement never quite settles. That is the next great consequence, and it emerges slowly enough that no one in this world could ever name it. A cluster of shelters may appear beside a dependable stream, near shell beds, near seasonal game paths, near a stand of useful trees or a sheltered rise that catches morning light and breaks the wind. For a time it may look like the beginning of permanence. Ash deepens in familiar hearth spots, waste accumulates, footpaths wear into the ground. Children grow up recognizing the same tree trunks, the same stone outcrops, the same shallow places where water can still be reached when the dry season bites hardest. But the invisible structures that allow a village to become more than repeated cohabitation never fully form. The people return, perhaps often, perhaps for generations in loose succession. What they do not build is a stable social machine large enough to outlast confusion. In our own history, villages are not simply collections of huts. They're agreements stretched across time. They require expectations about who sleeps where, who stores what, who can claim which patch of ground, who owes labour, who may marry whom, how disputes are settled, how strangers are treated, how children are supervised, what happens when food fails, and how collective tasks are organised. None of these things need to be written at first, but they do need to be made legible and repeatable. That is one of language's quiet miracles. It turns habits into shared norms and norms into institutions. Even when people disagree, they are disagreeing inside an articulated framework. Without language, that framework remains dangerously thin. Routine can hold a group together for a while. Scale exposes the weakness. Small bands can rely on familiarity. Everyone knows who tends to dominate, who can be trusted near children, who hoards, who shares, who lashes out when hungry, who notices tracks, who keeps embers alive, who is best avoided when injured pride turns mean. This is social knowledge stored in direct experience, but as numbers rise, direct knowledge no longer covers the whole group. That is the threshold where speech in our world begins doing enormous hidden work. It carries reputation. It clarifies intentions. It spreads warnings before disaster forces first-hand proof. It preserves agreements when the people who made them are not in the same place. In a wordless settlement, these functions fail to scale. A person may know their immediate circle well, and still understand very little about those sleeping a short distance away. The result is friction long before anything resembling urban complexity could appear. Food sharing becomes harder to regulate because expectations cannot be broadly explained or defended. If one household or cluster repeatedly takes more than others think acceptable, the grievance cannot be generalized into a principle. It is felt as resentment, displayed as avoidance, aggression, withholding, or coalition behavior, but not stabilized into rule. The same is true of childcare, mating competition, injury response, and access to desirable resources such as shaded space, dry storage niches, protected sleeping sites, or reliable water points. In a speech-rich society, repeated conflict can eventually harden into custom. This side belongs to them. That source is used in this order. These people pair in this way. These offences trigger this response. Here, some customs may emerge locally through repetition. but they remain vulnerable to misunderstanding and collapse as soon as conditions change or new individuals enter the social field. Agriculture, if it is ever approached at all, would struggle under the same burden. Farming is often imagined as a simple technical leap, but it is also a social revolution built on delayed returns and coordinated labour. Seeds must be preserved rather than eaten. Land must be revisited, protected, cleared, or at least remembered in systematic ways. Harvests must be timed, surpluses must be divided or guarded. Knowledge about cycles must survive interruptions. None of this is impossible in the absolute sense without language, but all of it becomes much harder. A few people might notice that plants return more densely where seeds or waste were dropped. They might even begin to favour certain patches unconsciously. But the leap from casual encouragement of useful plants to organised cultivation depends on explanation, planning, and norm enforcement. It depends on people accepting present effort for future yield and coordinating around an invisible calendar. In this world, that is precisely the kind of collective abstraction that keeps slipping away. The evidence from real archaeology suggests that even with language, the move towards settled life is uneven, reversible, and contingent. People sometimes become more sedentary before full agriculture. Some rich environments support semi-permanent living through fishing, gathering, or seasonal abundance alone. So it is possible that speechless humans could form recurring camps that last a long time in favourable locations. Coastlines with shellfish, river valleys with predictable fish runs, lake margins rich in birds and reeds, or woodlands with dependable nut crops might support substantial return occupation. But recurring occupation is not the same as a true village system. What survives in the record suggests that durable settlement requires more than resource richness. It requires social memory dense enough to keep many people aligned when immediate incentives diverge. That is exactly what language supplies and this world lacks. Another obstacle appears in division of labour. Human communities grow more complex when not everyone must do everything all the time. Specialists emerge. Even in faint early forms, people more trusted with tool-making, healing, ritual, storage, seasonal timing, exchange, construction. Specialization does not demand modern professions, but it does demand reliable teaching, social recognition, and support structures. A community has to understand, in some durable way, why one person spends less time foraging because they are doing something else the group values. Without language, such arrangements remain fragile. Visible skill can earn deference in the moment, but generalized roles are harder to maintain. A skilled toolmaker may be admired while people watch, but there is no easy way to preserve a collective agreement that this person should receive more food support during long periods of shaping stone or wood. The role never becomes institution. It remains temporary advantage. Storage creates the same problem from another angle. Surplus is powerful only when it's protected by social trust or force. Once a group begins storing food, fuel, tools, or other valued goods, questions of access become unavoidable. Who may take? Who decides? Who guards? Who remembers what belongs to whom? In our own history, property systems begin long before written law, but they still rely on a shared symbolic environment of recognition, obligation, threat, and memory. In the speechless world, possession is easier to defend physically than socially. A body near an object can guard it. Beyond that, claims weaken rapidly. This encourages immediate use over long-term accumulation. Why preserve a large surplus that others may raid or misunderstand? When the norms protecting deferred consumption cannot be firmly stabilized, the same weakness undermines architecture, People could certainly build more durable shelters if materials and skill allow it. Repeated construction teaches much. Stone windbreaks, branch frameworks, hide coverings, packed earth improvements, even modest communal spaces are conceivable. But large coordinated building projects require planning beyond direct imitation. They require role assignment, sequence management, correction, and often willingness to work for benefits not instantly visible. Language makes such projects dramatically easier because it allows shared mental models of structures not yet complete. Without it, construction remains bounded by what can be demonstrated locally and understood at a glance. A group can repair, enlarge, and repeat familiar forms. Radical scaling becomes difficult. One lesser-known lesson from anthropology is that social complexity often depends on what might be called portable trust. People cooperate not only because they know each other personally, but because they share stories, kin terms, categories, rituals, and norms that make strangers legible before direct experience accumulates. Villages can function because a newcomer can be placed within a known framework, a relative of these people, an outsider under these rules, a spouse with these obligations, a child of that house, a guest who must be fed but watched. Without language, strangers and semi-strangers remain much harder to classify. Even within a recurring settlement, those not immediately familiar remain sources of uncertainty. That uncertainty limits growth more effectively than any visible wall. This helps explain why the village in such a world would always hover near dissolution. A bad season comes, food tightens, old tensions sharpen. One subgroup drifts away toward another water source, another stays but stops sharing as before. Young adults pair unpredictably, shifting alliances with them. An injury removes someone who quietly held many routines together. A few children die, and the emotional shock alters behavior around risk. None of these things are unique to speechless humans. All human communities face pressure. The difference is that language allows later societies to repair the invisible net. They can renegotiate, accuse, justify, remind, threaten, plead, memorialize, and formalize. Here the net is mostly made of habit and immediate force. Once torn, it is much harder to mend. Over long stretches of time, this likely produces a world of repeated near settlements rather than enduring villages. Places are used deeply, but not transformed into continuously self-aware communities. There may be favoured sites with old middens, layered ash, post holes, sleeping depressions, reused paths, and traces of many seasons of life. Archaeologists in such a world, if archaeologists ever existed, might find evidence of repeated occupation and wonder whether the threshold of village life had almost been crossed. In a sense it had, again and again. But almost is not enough. Without the symbolic machinery to stabilize relationships, labor, memory, and claims, the settlement remains a pattern of return, not a civic beginning. This is one of the strangest losses in the entire thought experiment, because from the outside the ingredients are all present. Humans have hands for building, emotions for belonging, memory for place, appetite for shelter, and enough intelligence to see the benefits of staying where resources can be organized. The landscape offers opportunities. The bodies gather. The fires return to old ground. Children are born into the same clearings where their parents once slept. It feels, for a moment, like the birth of the village. And then, because no one can quite lock the social structure into transmissible form, it loosens again. So the human world remains dispersed not because no one ever wants permanence, but because permanence is more than staying put. It is a verbal achievement before it becomes an architectural one. It depends on invisible agreements that can survive misunderstanding, absence, and death. In this world, those agreements never gain enough depth. The village trembles into view and dissolves. Then it does so again somewhere else, and again after that. Like a shoreline shape formed briefly by retreating water, always suggestive of something larger, never stable enough to hold. By now the pattern is unmistakable. Tools do improve in this world, but they improve the way a shoreline changes under a slow tide by inches, unevenly, with long pauses that make movement almost impossible to notice from within a single lifetime. A stone flake becomes a little sharper because someone strikes from a better angle. A hafted point almost appears because one group discovers, through repetition and luck, that binding stone to wood can sometimes survive impact. A carrying sling becomes more reliable. A digging stick is hardened more effectively in coals. A shelter frame is braced against wind in a way that lasts longer into the wet season. None of this is trivial. Taken together, these are the beginnings of technology in the deepest human sense, not just using found objects, but altering materials to extend the body's reach. The tragedy is that each advance remains perched on a narrow ledge. It can persist for a while. It struggles to become a staircase. In our own history, technology is not simply invention, it is inheritance under pressure. One person discovers, another copies, a third refines, a fourth adapts the method to a new material, and a fifth teaches it widely enough that it ceases to belong to any one mind. That is how a species escapes the prison of individual brilliance. Without language, the prison door never fully opens. Techniques can be seen and imitated, yes, but explanation remains thin, correction remains local. And hidden principles often remain invisible. A young toolmaker can reproduce the broad shape of an object and still miss the exact force, angle, timing, moisture, heating condition, or material selection that made the original superior. In a language-rich world, such details are hard enough to preserve. In this world they slip away constantly. Stone technology offers the clearest example because it is both ancient and unforgiving. To strike stone well is to understand fracture without formal science. Good knapping depends on choosing the right core, reading internal structure, preparing surfaces, controlling force, and anticipating how invisible energy will travel through the material. Skilled modern knappers often struggle to explain every motion verbally, even though they possess language, because much of their knowledge is procedural and embodied. Yet language still helps enormously. It allows attention to be directed: strike here, not there. Watch the ridge. This floor runs inward. This angle is too steep. This material becomes unpredictable after heating. Remove that support, and teaching returns almost entirely to demonstration. A learner can watch the master's hands for years and still fail to grasp what the master cannot visibly isolate. This is why technology in a speechless human world remains trapped at the edge of adequacy. Many tools become good enough, few become deeply standardized or rapidly improvable. Standardization matters more than it first appears. Once a form becomes repeatable, people can begin specializing materials around it, storing parts, trusting performance, and building further techniques on top of it. If points are consistently shaped, hunting strategies can adjust to them. If containers are reliably made, storage possibilities expand. If cutting tools remain sharp and predictable, hide processing, woodworking, and food preparation all improve. In this alternate world, consistency is much harder to achieve across groups or generations. Local traditions emerge, then blur, then vanish. Woodworking would likely remain especially constrained, not because humans lack hands or need, but because wood preserves poorly in the archaeological record even in our own world, and because woodworking often depends on sequential instruction. A spear shaft that flies straight requires selection, drying, smoothing, balancing, perhaps straightening under heat, perhaps careful point fitting. A trap frame requires understanding tension and trigger behavior. A shelter support must bear load in ways not obvious to an inexperienced eye. These are the sorts of things that can absolutely be taught through demonstration, but only if the learner sees enough repetitions under varied conditions. They are also exactly the sorts of things that benefit from verbal warning about hidden failure points. Where language never arrives, people can still become highly skilled artisans in narrow local traditions. What they cannot do easily is preserve large interconnected craft systems. This is where agriculture again hovers near possibility and then recedes. It is not merely that farming requires planning, though it does. It also requires tools that support delayed, coordinated work, digging implements that can be reproduced, cutting edges that can withstand repeated harvesting, carrying methods, storage containers, and increasingly detailed environmental timing. A few of these elements might arise separately. People could dig. People could reap in simple ways. People could scatter seeds accidentally or even intentionally in a local and unsystematic manner. But technology only becomes transformative when many reliable practices converge and reinforce one another. That convergence is rare in a world where techniques spread mainly by sight and repetition. No single explanation fully accounts for why some human innovations ignite whole new lifeways, while others fade. But cumulative transmission is one of the strongest candidates. Here, cumulative transmission remains too weak to cross crucial thresholds. Containers may be one of the most underestimated losses. A civilization begins to change when it can move and store things efficiently: water, seeds, dried food, embers, pigments, tools, medicinal plants, fibers, baskets, skins, gourds, nets, woven slings, bark vessels, and eventually pottery are all part of that transformation in our own history. Yet container technology is deceptively complex. Good weaving, sealing, drying, firing, and shaping all depend on repeated fine-grained instruction. Some simple forms would certainly arise in this world because necessity presses hard and many steps can be shown. But the more refined the container, the more fragile the tradition becomes without language. A vessel that cracks less often because clay must be tempered a certain way, dried at a certain pace, placed in heat at a certain stage of moisture, is precisely the kind of insight that dies if it cannot be explained beyond immediate performance. No writing follows from this, of course, because writing is not just marks on a surface, it is language made durable. Without spoken language of sufficient richness, there is nothing writing can encode in the full human sense. There may still be scratches, tally-like marks, directional signs, repeated motifs, ownership hints, or emotionally significant traces, but they do not become script. There is no grammar waiting to be captured, no names to list, no debts to record, no prayers to preserve, no law to fix in durable form, and because writing never appears, every technology that depends on written memory also remains unborn. There are no account systems, no technical manuals, no land records, no astronomical logs, no cumulative mathematics. The species remains dependent on live bodies for every transmission that matters. This also cripples measurement. People without language can still perceive proportion, they can still compare lengths, judge weight by feel, recognize when one object fits another, and remember rough distances by movement. But formal measurement systems require agreed symbols, repeatable units, and abstract categories that outlast the thing being measured. That is what allows architecture to scale, irrigation to function, calendars to stabilize, trade to expand, and engineering to escape improvisation. In a speechless world, approximation remains possible. Exact transferable measurement remains rare. A structure can be rebuilt by copying the old one. It cannot easily be designed to a shared standard that strangers can reproduce years later. One lesser-known truth about technological history is that many breakthroughs are less like single sparks and more like dense webs. Metallurgy, for example, does not emerge because someone merely sees shiny material in fire. It requires repeated encounters with ores, fuel management, temperature control, containment, hammering, observation of change, and eventually chains of skilled practice dense enough to preserve experimental results. Similar webs underpin advanced weaving, boat building, fermentation, masonry, and nearly every craft later civilizations depend on. In this world, small pieces of such webs might appear here and there. A group notices stone changing after heating. Another uses pitch or resin more effectively. Another learns that tightly twisted fibers hold surprising strain. Yet without language, the web seldom thickens. Threads remain isolated. That does not mean people are not inventive. In fact, they may be inventive all the time in the immediate sense. A broken tool demands improvisation. An injured limb demands adaptation. A changing shoreline demands new routes. The human hand and eye remain restless. But most invention remains trapped in circumstance. It solves this problem, here, now, under these conditions, for these observers. It does not become a general solution. It does not travel widely. And when it does travel, it often loses the hidden insight that made it effective. Technology becomes a patchwork of local successes rather than a rising curve. The emotional atmosphere of such a world is easy to miss from a distance. Modern people often imagine technological stagnation as mental stagnation, as though the inhabitants simply failed to think hard enough. The truth would be harsher and more tragic. They think, observe, attempt, and refine constantly. They can sense usefulness. They can value competence. They can see that some objects perform better than others. What they lack is a dependable way to carry subtle improvement through many minds and many years. A superior tool may be admired, copied poorly, and then quietly disappear. A useful process may survive in one camp and be unknown 2 valleys away for centuries. Progress exists, but it has almost no memory. By this stage, the great missing shape of civilization is visible in negative form. There are still no ploughs, no mills, no roads in the real sense, no durable boats with standardized construction, no monumental architecture, no precise calendars, no written laws, no numerical records, no instruments built on layered theory. All of those belong to a later chain of consequences, but the chain is already broken here among sharper flakes, stronger bindings, tougher baskets, steadier hearths, and better shelters that never quite become a true technological tradition. The species keeps touching the edge of transformation and sliding back into local mastery, and so humanity remains astonishingly capable and permanently constrained. A hand axe might become elegant in one region, a net might become subtly better in another, a carrying frame might reduce strain on a long migration route. Yet none of these gains opens the gate to civilization, because civilization depends on tools that do more than work. They must be teachable, standardizable, explainable, and improvable across generations that do not share the same eyes. Language is what makes that possible in our world. Without it, technology hovers at the border between brilliance and disappearance, always useful, sometimes impressive, never cumulative enough to change the fate of the species. By the time technology reaches its limit, another absence has already hollowed out the future. There is no writing because there is no language rich enough to write. That sounds obvious at first, almost too obvious to matter, but it may be the single most devastating loss in the entire alternate history. Speech, in our world, allows knowledge to travel beyond the immediate scene. Writing allows knowledge to survive the death of the speaker. Once that second threshold is crossed, the human species changes direction entirely. Memory no longer depends only on living minds. Rules can outlast rulers. Accounts can outlast merchants. Observations can outlast seasons. A calculation made in one generation can be checked, corrected, and extended by another. Without language, none of this even begins. Human experience remains trapped in breath, gesture, and direct demonstration. The moment a body disappears, much of what it knew disappears with it. It is worth lingering here, because writing is often mistaken for a late ornament of civilization, something that comes after the real work of society is already done. In reality, even before writing becomes common, the possibility of durable symbolic storage transforms what humans can build. A village can become a city only when obligations, property, labor, and authority survive beyond face-to-face familiarity. Trade can become extensive only when value, debt, promise, and quantity can be tracked more reliably than memory alone allows. Law can become more than immediate force only when decisions persist outside the emotions of the moment. Mathematics can become cumulative only when symbols hold relationships steady long enough to be manipulated with precision. Writing does not create all of these things from nothing, but it locks them into permanence. Without language, that lock is never forged. This means bureaucracy, one of the least romantic but most important inventions in history, never exists. There are no lists of grain, no records of births, no boundaries surveyed, no tax obligations, no temple inventories, no work gangs assigned by durable schedule, no stores counted against bad seasons, no scribes comparing deliveries from one month to the next. To modern ears, bureaucracy sounds stale, yet it is one of the key tools by which humans extend cooperation beyond the village scale. It allows strangers to interact within known systems. It allows decisions to be remembered by institutions rather than by the moods of particular people. In a speechless humanity, administration never rises above immediate management by force, custom, and direct observation. That may be enough for tiny groups. It is fatal to anything larger. Law fails in the same way. Social rules still exist, certainly. Every human group has expectations. Aggression is tolerated in some forms and punished in others. Food is shared according to pressures that may never become explicit but are no less real. Sexual access, child care, injury response, territory use, sleeping arrangements, and conflict all generate repeated patterns. But law, in the fuller sense, requires language. It requires categories of offence, remembered precedents, authority that can be invoked when the authority figure is absent, and procedures that can outlast individual encounters. A later human can say this was forbidden before. This punishment followed last time. This agreement still binds us because it was made publicly and remembered. A speechless human cannot preserve that kind of abstraction. Norms remain embodied, local, and unstable. Justice never becomes a system. It remains reaction. Mathematics, too, stays unborn except in its faintest practical shadows. Humans without language can still perceive more and less, longer and shorter, heavier and lighter, near and far. They can compare bundles, feel whether a load is balanced, notice whether a shelter frame mirrors another, sense approximate seasonality, even track small quantities in immediate context. But formal mathematics depends on symbols that preserve relation outside direct perception. Number words are not merely labels, they allow exact counting, ordering, grouping, and manipulation. From there come calendars, surveying, trade equivalents, architecture, astronomy, engineering, and eventually science itself. Remove the symbolic scaffolding, and quantity remains rough, intuitive, and local. A person may know there are too few fish traps or enough hands to drag a carcass. They do not arrive at divisible units, ratios, records, or transferable computation. This is where the entire upper story of civilization disappears before its foundations are even poured. No archives means no historiography. No numbers means no bookkeeping. No formal marks means no maps in the true sense. No contracts, no genealogies, no doctrinal texts, no codified rituals, no engineering plans, no medicinal records, no astronomical tables. In our own world, even the earliest clay tokens and proto-writing systems do extraordinary work by fixing information outside the body. They allow memory to become collective in a way that is not dependent on everyone having been present. Scholars still debate how exactly writing first emerged and which pressures mattered most: trade, administration, ritual, prestige, accounting. But what survives in the record suggests the same broad truth across early civilizations. Once humans can store meaning materially, complexity accelerates. None of that acceleration occurs here. There may still be marks. That much is plausible. Humans might scratch repeated signs near a favored crossing, score a bone or stick in relation to some habit, arrange stones in meaningful patterns, leave traces associated with individuals or recurring places. Gesture-rich species often use space symbolically in limited ways, but without a full linguistic system behind them, such marks remain thin. They do not become true writing because they are not attached to a robust grammar and lexicon. They cannot say the river rises after 3 nights of hot wind, or these stores belong to that lineage, or this child descends from the one buried near the red cliff, or bring more fibre before the rains. At best they point, suggest, remind. They do not encode thought with the precision needed to create durable institutions. Even memory palaces of the body, so important in oral cultures, cannot take full shape. In a spoken but non-literate society, memory is often astonishingly strong because language itself serves as storage. Songs, chants, epics, legal formulas, genealogies, and ritual sequences can preserve enormous quantities of information with remarkable fidelity. Oral tradition is not a primitive substitute for writing. In many cases, it is a highly refined technology of memory. But it still depends on language. It depends on repeated wording, structure, rhythm, and collective correction. In this alternate world, that entire possibility vanishes as well. There are no epics, no law chants, no mnemonic recitations of root, season, debt, taboo, or kinship. The body remembers movements. The group remembers routines. Complex verbal memory systems never arise. This has an especially dramatic effect on religion and cosmology. Earlier sections have already stripped away myth in the usual sense, but without writing or formal oral tradition, even recurring sacred systems remain shallow. There are no priestly classes preserving doctrine, no sacred calendars, no ritual texts, no temple accounts, no creation narratives copied over generations, no hymns stabilizing a worldview. There may still be awe, fear, reverence towards certain caves, peaks, waters, animals, or burial spaces. There may still be repeated gestures toward death, fertility, danger, or the sky. But religion cannot become a structured long-term institution. It lacks the linguistic and material memory required to coordinate large groups around invisible commitments. One lesser-known lesson from the history of science makes the loss even clearer. Scientific progress does not depend only on observation or intelligence. It depends on records. An eclipse noticed once is interesting. A series of eclipses recorded, compared, and calculated becomes astronomy. A medicinal effect observed once is luck. Repeated treatments written down, contrasted, and transmitted become the beginnings of medicine. A wall that stands is useful. Measurements and principles preserved across builders become engineering. In the absence of language and writing, human beings may remain sharp observers of the natural world. But observation never thickens into cumulative theory. The species sees much, understands some, preserves little. Geography also remains strangely small, no matter how far people travel. Humans can move across astonishing distances without maps in the modern sense, using landmarks, stars, currents, coastlines, and embodied memory. Many non-literate peoples in our own world navigate with extraordinary precision, but again, this depends on language-rich traditions of naming, route description, seasonal guidance, and collective instruction. In the speechless world, travel remains possible and sometimes extensive, especially by repeated route use. What does not emerge is geographic knowledge that can be stored independently of the traveller. No region can create a durable shared picture of distant lands. No one compiles route systems, hazard zones, resource locations, or territorial boundaries into a transmissible body of knowledge. The world remains large, and humans remain mentally local within it. Power stays local too. There are no kingdoms, no states, no empires, not merely because armies cannot scale, but because administration cannot scale. Authority without record fades almost immediately outside the reach of the body enforcing it. A dominant individual might control a camp. A coalition might dominate a valley for a time. Fear can travel through direct experience, but command cannot extend stably across distance and generations when it cannot be formalized. Orders are not preserved. Tribute is not counted. Succession is not recorded. Territory is not surveyed. A ruler can exist. Rule cannot. So by the time one reaches the question of civilization in the ordinary sense, the answer has already been decided. Civilization is not just stone walls, fields, temples, and roads. It is externalized memory. It is the ability of a society to store meaning outside individual brains, and then use that stored meaning to coordinate action on scales no living group could manage through familiarity alone. Language creates the first layer of that memory, writing hardens it. In this alternate human story, both layers fail. The species remains trapped within a narrow present, forever dependent on who is alive, who is watching, who remembers directly, and who can still demonstrate the necessary act before dying. That is why the absence of writing is more than an absence of books. It is the absence of continuity powerful enough to build cities, preserve law, transmit science, accumulate mathematics, or even remember the past in any deep and organized way. It is the absence of civilization's second brain. Human beings would still walk the earth in great numbers, still adapt, still improvise, still love and grieve and struggle. But every generation would stand in a thinning haze of lived habit, rather than on a platform of inherited thought. The page would remain blank forever because the sentence never arrives, and with that, most of the world we call human history never even has the chance to begin. When strangers appear on the horizon in our world, language races ahead of the body. Even before hands touch, words begin building categories: friend, rival, kin, trader, trespasser, guest, messenger, captive, ally. Speech allows uncertainty to be managed before violence resolves it. Names are exchanged, intentions are tested, lies are told, promises are made, ritual phrases soften fear, status can be signaled, kinship can be claimed or invented. Trade terms can emerge between people who have never met before. In a world where humans never create language, all of that disappears. The stranger remains stubbornly and dangerously immediate. He is not a man from another valley seeking shelter. He is only a body at a distance, carrying unknown intentions that cannot be safely clarified. That makes every encounter between groups far more unstable than modern people first imagine. It is tempting to assume that gesture could fill the gap, and sometimes it would. Hands can be raised to show emptiness. Bodies can lower themselves to signal submission or caution. Food can be set down and pushed forward. Distance can be maintained to reduce threat. Repetition can build a crude rhythm of mutual toleration. Some exchanges would absolutely occur. Humans are too social, too observant, and too materially dependent not to attempt peaceful contact when conditions allow it. But the range of what can be negotiated remains extremely narrow. A gesture can mean peace. It can also mean surrender, uncertainty, invitation, or weakness. Without a shared symbolic system, every signal is trapped in the body that makes it and the body that interprets it. That is a dangerous place for meaning to live. Trade, in the simplest sense, could still exist. One group might have shells, pigment, tough stone, salt-rich ash, dried fish, strong fibers, or access to seasonal resources another lacks. Curiosity alone could drive exchange long before formal markets ever appear. Archaeology in our own world shows that even relatively early humans sometimes moved materials across remarkable distances. Though scholars still debate exactly how direct those networks were and how much depended on population density and social structure. In this alternate world, limited exchange is still plausible. Objects can be shown, offered, withheld, replaced. Mutual interest can be recognized, but trade remains bounded by immediacy. There is no bargaining in the full sense, no delayed debt, no remembered contract, no explanation of quality standards, no route directions for future visits, no reassurance that next season similar goods will be available upriver after the rains. Exchange remains episodic because trust cannot thicken. And trust is everything once dealings move beyond the visible moment. In a language-rich species, trust can be scaffolded by reputation, shared myth, ritual language, kinship claims, and institutions. A person need not know a stranger personally to know what category the stranger belongs to. They may be recognized as the in-laws of a neighboring clan, as traders under agreed custom, as pilgrims protected by taboo, as emissaries carrying authority from elsewhere. Those categories reduce uncertainty enough for cooperation to grow. In a speechless humanity, such categories remain fragile or absent. Familiarity can exist within repeated contact zones, but beyond that every meeting begins close to zero. The stranger cannot easily be embedded in memory outside direct recognition. This makes diplomacy almost impossible. A dispute over territory, water, mating access, or injury cannot be turned into a negotiated settlement that survives the moment. Perhaps two groups meet near a dry season pool both need. They posture, they display numbers, they offer or withhold space. One side backs down, or one side attacks, or both edge away and return at different times. But they cannot easily establish a durable understanding like this place is used by you after dawn and by us later. Or your young may pass here if they do not take from the traps. Or one injury last hot season is compensated by future exchange. These are all linguistic achievements. Without them, repeated tension tends to remain repeated tension. That does not mean every encounter becomes immediate violence. Violence is costly. Even highly aggressive animals often prefer display to injury because injury threatens survival. Humans without language would still understand fear, numbers, posture, and the risks of conflict. They could still bluff, avoid, shadow, observe, and retreat. In fact, there may be long phases of tense coexistence where groups learn each other's movement patterns through pure, repeated exposure. But coexistence of that kind remains shallow. It is not alliance. It is not confederation. It is not peace backed by mutual story or rule. It is parallel occupation under uncertainty. One of the strangest losses here is hospitality. In later human history, hospitality becomes one of the most powerful social technologies ever invented. It turns strangers into temporary protected persons under ritual expectation. It allows movement, trade, marriage, diplomacy, and cultural exchange to happen without every threshold becoming a battlefield. Hospitality works because it is symbolic. It tells both host and guest what roles they now occupy, without language. Some acts resembling hospitality might still occur. Food may be shared, shelter may be tolerated for a night. A wounded outsider may even be left alive or helped if emotional and practical conditions favour it, but there is no articulated guest status, no remembered oath, no binding expectation that the outsider is under temporary protection by rule rather than by mood. Mercy exists. Institution does not. Marriage across groups would also be much rarer, or at least much more unstable. Exogamy in our own species does enormous work. It spreads genes, reduces conflict, extends alliances, and creates webs of obligation larger than any single camp. But exogamy depends on more than attraction or capture. It depends on some way of recognizing relations, signaling consent or coercion, establishing future expectations, and integrating the outsider into a new network, without language. Some partner exchange might happen through repeated contact, movement, and bodily familiarity. Individuals may drift between groups, especially under scarcity or after conflict, but systematic alliance building through marriage becomes difficult to sustain. Outsiders remain harder to classify, and kinship itself cannot be extended into the highly articulated webs that later societies use to bind strangers into family. This would likely keep populations more genetically and culturally fragmented. Some interbreeding would certainly occur because humans move, meet, and mate under many conditions. Complete isolation is unlikely across all environments, but the scale and stability of exchange networks would be much smaller. Innovations would spread even more slowly than before because every group boundary becomes a heavy informational barrier, a useful tool, food practice, or seasonal strategy seen in one population might be noticed by another and imperfectly copied, but without explanation or repeated peaceful contact. The transfer remains thin. Scholars still debate how much population connectivity accelerated innovation in real prehistory, but most agree it mattered. In this world, connectivity is weak almost everywhere. There is also a darker consequence. Dehumanization in the modern sense may require language to become ideological, but suspicion of outsiders does not. It is older than speech. A wordless humanity would still distinguish familiar from unfamiliar with fierce emotional charge. Strange bodies, strange movement patterns, unfamiliar scents, unknown routines, all of these can trigger caution or aggression. Because no group can easily narrate the motives of another, uncertainty itself becomes one of the main drivers of conflict. An object taken may be read as theft, curiosity, or misunderstanding. A movement toward children may be seen as threat. A repeated path near camp may feel like surveillance. Without clarification, fear tends to fill the gap. And yet there would still be moments of eerie connection. Two groups might meet repeatedly at a shoreline rich in shellfish and slowly develop a shared rhythm of distance, approach, exchange, and retreat. Children might become curious first, as children often do. Adults might discover that certain gestures are interpreted similarly enough to sustain brief cooperation. An injured person might be aided by someone from another band for reasons no later historian could recover. Objects might move from hand to hand across landscapes through chains of cautious meeting. These moments matter because they show that humanity would not become purely solitary or universally murderous without language. The species would still reach outward. It would still try. What it could not do is stabilize those reaching gestures into systems broad enough to transform the social world. This helps explain why there are no states waiting in the future, no large trade corridors, no sacred roads, no diplomatic marriages between distant peoples, no long-distance broker networks. All of these require strangers to become legible before they become familiar. Language, ritual, and shared symbols make that possible in our world. Here the stranger remains an enduring problem. The border between groups is not merely a line in space, it is a cliff in mutual understanding. One lesser-known lesson from archaeology is that materials moving across space do not necessarily imply deep, peaceful integration. A shell far inland or a stone far from its quarry may travel through many hands. By trade, gifting, scavenging, theft, migration, or reuse. In this alternate world, such movements might still happen in modest ways, but the networks carrying them would be thin and fragile. The object might travel farther than the trust that moved it. That is the larger pattern of the species itself. Bodies can move. Goods can move. Even habits can sometimes move, but shared meaning does not travel well. So the meeting of strangers never becomes one of civilization's engines. It remains one of survival's risks. Humans still encounter one another beyond the familiar circle. They still test, watch, imitate, steal, avoid, exchange, and sometimes cooperate. But every such moment happens under a ceiling. No treaty can rise above it. No marketplace can stabilize beneath it. No alliance can be narrated into permanence. The unknown human remains almost as hard to interpret as the unknown landscape. And because of that, the world stays scattered. Valleys remain local worlds. Coasts remain local worlds. Rivers connect bodies more easily than they connect societies. Humanity is still one species, but it never fully learns how to recognize itself at a distance. By this point, the shape of the species is becoming painfully clear. Humans still cooperate, but only within a narrow radius of direct familiarity, direct sight, and direct need. That alone is enough to keep them alive in many landscapes. Small groups can hunt, forage, guard children, tend wounds, move camp, and survive hard seasons through shared labor rooted in instinct, imitation, and emotional intelligence. But cooperation in the larger human sense, the kind that binds hundreds, then thousands, then millions of people into systems none of them could hold in their minds alone, never arrives. The great human expansion into politics, religion, trade, war, law, and organized memory depends on a trick this species never learns. It never learns how to make invisible agreements durable. That failure reaches far beyond convenience. In our world, a society can ask people to do difficult things for abstract reasons. Plant now so the group can eat later. Carry stone for a building that will not shelter you tonight. Obey a rule even when the wronged person is absent. Accept a leader whose authority is partly symbolic. Fight for a boundary you cannot see in the moment because your people claim it. Give a portion of your food to support a specialist who makes tools, conducts ritual, remembers law, or negotiates with strangers. None of those arrangements are natural in the simple biological sense. They must be explained, justified, repeated, dramatized, and remembered. Language is what makes them feel real enough to organize behavior around. Without it, cooperation remains vivid but shallow. People work together. They do not build systems together. War, interestingly, would still exist. It might even be frequent in some regions, because competition over water, shelter, mates, safe routes, and seasonal abundance does not require speech to become violent. Ambush, intimidation, retaliation, and territorial pressure all emerge among social animals under the right conditions. Humans without language would still understand threat displays, numbers, pursuit, injury, and revenge in the immediate emotional sense. But warfare would be limited in form. There would be raids, chases, beatings, killings, perhaps coordinated attacks by small groups familiar with one another's movements. What would not emerge easily is organized war as an institution campaigns with strategic depth, command structures, logistics, propaganda, remembered treaties, tribute systems, or conquered populations administered over time. Violence would remain local because administration remains impossible. This is one of the stranger paradoxes of the thought experiment. Language does not only create peace, it also creates organized conflict on scales no other animal achieves. It allows armies to form, histories of grievance to be preserved, identities to harden, and obedience to flow through chains of command. Remove language, and some of the worst human cruelties never happen. There are no ideological purges, no empires marching under banners of destiny, no priesthood sanctifying slaughter, no tax-supported standing armies. But the disappearance of large war does not bring the disappearance of violence. It simply keeps violence personal, episodic, and hard to resolve. A killing may trigger reprisal, yet no durable settlement can contain the memory of why it happened or what compensation would end it. Feud exists in fragments. Justice never rises high enough to extinguish it. Trade suffers from the same confinement. Simple exchange remains possible, as earlier encounters have shown. A useful object can be offered for another. Curiosity can draw people together. Material scarcity can encourage cautious contact. But trade as a true system requires more than the visible swap. It requires conventions, remembered roots, deferred trust, equivalence, specialization, and sometimes institutions strong enough to protect exchange even between people who dislike one another. In our world, trade does astonishing cultural work. It spreads not just goods, but ideas, techniques, diseases, crops, stories, gods, and maps. It turns distance into opportunity. In the speechless world, trade remains too thin to perform that transformation. It is not absent, only arrested. A shell may move inland, a sharp stone may travel outward, but networks do not thicken into economies. Religion, too, remains curiously stunted, or survives easily enough. Fear of death survives. Reverence for certain places, animals, caves, peaks, storms, or ancestors in the immediate emotional sense could emerge almost anywhere. Repeated ritual gestures could become attached to danger, grief, fertility, or seasonal return. But religion as a society-making force depends on shared invisible claims that certain beings exist, that certain acts matter beyond the visible, that certain places are sacred for reasons remembered and repeated, that certain people mediate with powers others cannot access, that sacrifice, purity, taboo, or prayer preserve order. These are linguistic architectures. Without them, no temple system forms, no theology coheres, no priesthood endures, no doctrine spreads. Spiritual feeling may remain intense. Organized religion does not. Politics, therefore, never moves far beyond dominance, prestige, and immediate coalition. There may still be strong individuals. There may still be admired hunters, feared aggressors, calming elders, unusually skilled healers, or those whose bodily presence draws others into orbit. Groups may align behind them for a season or a crisis, but authority never becomes office. It cannot be inherited symbolically, recorded, justified abstractly, or extended reliably beyond those who directly know the person in question. A chiefdom, let alone a kingdom, requires more than influence. It requires symbols, stories, obligations, and remembered structures that survive the death or absence of a leader. None of that stabilizes here. Power remains charismatic, physical, and temporary. This has enormous consequences for labor. A great many human accomplishments are really labor coordination problems disguised as culture. Irrigation is coordinated labor. Monumental building is coordinated labor. Harvest storage is coordinated labor. Road maintenance, fishing weirs, fortifications, drainage, terracing, mining, milling, and shipbuilding are all coordinated labor extended across time. To achieve them, a society must convince many people to do effortful, often monotonous work whose full benefit is delayed or distributed unevenly. Language helps because it can explain purpose, assign roles, record contributions, threaten penalties, praise obedience, and bind present effort to future reward. Without language, humans would still cooperate on visible short-term tasks, dragging a carcass, driving prey, lifting a shelter frame, tending an injured person, but long projects with complex sequencing would be rare. The limit is not strength. It is organized commitment. One lesser-known truth about civilization is that large-scale cooperation often depends less on mutual affection than on symbolic compression. People obey laws they did not write because the law has a name, a form, a memory, and an institution behind it. They trust money because it symbolizes value beyond the object itself. They participate in rituals because the ritual connects them to a group larger than any room they stand in. They follow calendars because named months and repeated records make time collectively legible. These are all compressions of overwhelming social complexity into transmissible symbols. A speechless humanity has almost none of this. It must negotiate reality mostly at full size, in person, again and again. That is exhausting. It makes large cooperation prohibitively expensive. So the human world remains thinly networked. Small groups form, split, merge, avoid, and occasionally align. But there are no durable federations of villages because there are no true villages in the full institutional sense. There are no trade leagues, no sacred confederacies, no law zones, no tax districts, no military alliances remembered beyond immediate participants, no seasonal assemblies preserving large identities through shared narrative. Even when many people gather briefly around rich resources, migrations, or environmental bottlenecks, the gathering does not become polity. It becomes a crowd of temporary bodies coordinated by circumstance and dissolved by uncertainty. The emotional cost of this is easy to underestimate. Modern people are used to living inside vast invisible systems that hold when strangers pass, when leaders change, when knowledge must be recovered, when debts must be honored, when shared projects continue after individuals die. Those systems often fail, but their existence is one of the reasons modern life can scale at all. In this alternate history, every human group lives much closer to social zero. Cooperation must be rebuilt constantly through proximity, repetition, dominance, trust earned in person, and direct observation. Nothing abstract can carry much weight. As a result, the species spends enormous energy maintaining what later societies get almost for free from language and symbols. And yet the desire to cooperate would still be there. Humans are not solitary cats dressed in primate skin. They're intensely social creatures shaped by dependency, shared child-rearing, food sharing, and emotional contagion. They want help. They need help. They calm in groups and panic in groups. They read eyes, posture, hesitation, urgency. A speechless humanity would not stop reaching toward larger forms of life. It would simply fail, again and again, to stabilize them. A valley might briefly come under the influence of one dominant cluster. A migration route might be seasonally shared by several groups through tacit avoidance and occasional exchange. A burial place might attract recurring visits from loosely connected bands. But none of these become the scaffolding of civilization. They remain partial, temporary, vulnerable to weather, conflict, memory loss, and the death of key individuals. So this is the true limit of cooperation in a world without language. Humans can stand shoulder to shoulder. They can defend, hunt, carry, mourn, nurse, imitate, and endure. But they cannot easily cooperate with the absent, the future, the dead, or the unknown. They cannot bind strangers into rules, transform memory into institution, or turn repetition into political order. War stays small, trade stays thin, religion stays local, leadership stays personal. Society never learns how to thicken beyond the immediate circle of the scene. The species survives, but it survives in fragments, always capable of more in body and mind than its communication will ever allow it to become. For most of human history in our own world, nature is never fully under control. Crops fail, rivers move, winters bite harder than expected, disease arrives without warning, and predators take the inattentive with indifferent efficiency. Yet language changes the balance. It lets people warn those who are not present, compare one disaster with another, preserve rare lessons, and build collective habits from remembered danger. It turns catastrophe into memory, and memory into preparation. In a world where humans never create language, That transformation never quite happens. Nature keeps the upper hand not because human beings are weak, but because every hard lesson is harder to preserve than the force that taught it. Disease becomes one of the clearest examples. A speechless humanity would still recognize sickness. No one needs words to see fever, swelling, blood, rash, trembling, delirium, or the stillness that comes before death. Care would still exist. The healthy would bring water, touch the burning skin, clean waste when affection or obligation overcame disgust, pull the suffering away from cold ground, or avoid them when fear took over. Some useful practices might emerge by habit, separation of the gravely ill in some cases, preference for cleaner water in others, avoidance of visibly spoiled food, intuitive caution around corpses. But the species would struggle to move from recognition to theory. It could not easily say this sickness passed from one person to another after the rains, or this water source kills only when the flood leaves it stagnant, or do not use the same cutting edge on the wounded. The evidence remains incomplete on how much practical epidemiology can emerge without language, but no single explanation fully accounts for sustained disease prevention where knowledge cannot be stored, compared, and generalized. That matters most when illness behaves inconsistently. A wound infection may kill one person and spare another. A contaminated pool may sicken a few and leave others seemingly unharmed. A coughing disease may spread through a camp slowly enough to confuse cause and effect. In a speaking species, people can be wrong about disease for thousands of years and still improve survival through partial observations preserved in rule, taboo, and custom. Wash here, do not touch there, burn this, bury that. Boil this water, keep the sick apart. Many of these rules can exist long before anyone understands microbes. In the speechless world, some habits still appear, but they remain harder to stabilize beyond direct repetition. A rare outbreak may terrify one generation and leave almost nothing usable for the next. Climate shifts would be even more punishing. In real human history, climate has repeatedly shaped migration, collapse, adaptation, and invention. Droughts change routes, cold snaps alter prey movement, floods redraw settlement patterns, coastlines retreat or advance. Grasslands shrink, forests spread, lakes vanish, deserts bloom briefly and then harden again. Humans survive these changes not because they dominate climate, but because they compare memory across generations and turn scattered experiences into strategy. Someone remembers the old dry spring, someone else remembers where water held longest. A story preserves a route, a ritual calendar preserves timing, a place name stores warning. Without language, all of that thins dangerously. A community may still react in the moment with impressive flexibility, but longer-term adaptation becomes fragile because the past cannot fully advise the future. This is especially devastating for rare but recurring disasters. Floodplains might be rich for years and then suddenly lethal when waters rise far beyond ordinary experience. Volcanic regions might offer fertile ground and then bury it under ash after generations of calm. Tsunami-prone coasts might appear safe until the sea withdraws in a way only the distant memory of ancestors could teach people to fear. In our world, oral traditions sometimes preserve astonishingly old hazard memory, though scholars still debate how often and how accurately. Some flood stories, volcanic traditions, and coastal warnings seem to encode real environmental knowledge beneath later layers of myth. What survives in the record suggests that language can carry danger across centuries. In a wordless humanity, such continuity is mostly impossible. The sea can kill the grandchildren of people who once learned its pattern, and the lesson begins almost from nothing again. Predators would remain a constant pressure as well. Humans without language could still defend themselves with fire, tools, watchfulness, and group cohesion. They would not simply surrender the landscape to every large carnivore. But predator management depends heavily on shared warning and cumulative memory. A river crossing known to hold crocodiles, a cave used by big cats in one season but not another, a scavenger pattern that signals danger after dark. These are exactly the kinds of environmental facts that language turns into durable caution. Without it, direct witnesses know, then die. Those nearby may inherit a mood of unease or a repeated avoidance behavior, but once circumstances shift, the reasoning erodes. Scholars still debate how much predation shaped early human evolution after weapon use expanded. Yet in a world of weakened information transfer, the balance would remain harsher for much longer. Fire, again, sits on the edge between human power and natural supremacy. In our own history, humans gradually become extraordinary fire users, not only for warmth and cooking, but for shaping landscapes, driving game, clearing growth, encouraging useful plants, and protecting camps. Many traditional societies held highly sophisticated fire knowledge encoded in seasonal practice and oral teaching. A speechless humanity might still use fire well in immediate terms. They could keep it, carry it, fear it, rely on it. But fire ecology is subtle. Burn too early and the growth changes. Burn too late and the flames run hotter. Burn one patch and animals move differently. Burn repeatedly and the whole landscape shifts. These are not obvious relationships without repeated explanation. So nature would deny humans one of their greatest tools for shaping whole environments. Fire remains servant in the camp and mystery in the wider land. There is a deeper pattern in all of this. Nature does not only challenge the body, it challenges memory. A species can survive storms, droughts, parasites, and predators if it can accumulate responses faster than the world changes. That is one of the hidden achievements of language. It increases the speed at which experience hardens into shared adaptation. Without it, humans remain clever but slow in the wrong way. They can react quickly in the moment and still adapt slowly across generations because lessons do not stack securely. One valley learns to survive a hard winter, another learns to exploit shellfish during game collapse. Another learns that a certain shelter orientation reduces infant deaths in cold wind. Yet these insights rarely join into a broader human inheritance. This also affects mobility. One might assume a speechless humanity would simply stay more nomadic to evade local disaster, and in many cases that would be true. Mobility is a powerful hedge against failure. But mobility without communicable planning is risky too. Unknown terrain carries unknown food, unknown hazards, unknown neighbours, unknown disease loads, and unknown seasonal traps. In our world, migrations can be guided by spoken memory, route naming, borrowed reports, and inherited stories of places never seen by the traveller. Here, movement is much more dependent on immediate scouting and desperate trial. A species can wander widely and still remain informationally trapped, always arriving in a new place with far less usable inherited knowledge than the landscape requires. One lesser-known lesson from paleoanthropology is that many extinctions and bottlenecks do not come from a single dramatic event, but from repeated stress. A population becomes smaller after drought, then weaker after disease, then more fragmented after habitat change, then more vulnerable to inbreeding, predation, or lost innovation. The decline is cumulative even when no single blow seems decisive. A humanity without language would live much closer to such thresholds, not necessarily on the edge of total extinction at every moment, but close enough that environmental instability remains a permanent governing force. They would survive many crises, perhaps even spread widely, yet do so without ever gaining the deep adaptive cushion that language later provides. And because nature keeps the upper hand, many things that later humans take for granted never become secure. Childhood remains more dangerous because warnings cannot travel far ahead of experience. Old age remains rarer because accumulated knowledge cannot protect bodies as effectively from recurring risk. Pregnancy and birth remain more perilous because practical obstetric knowledge, where it exists, is difficult to preserve in detail. Seasonal hunger bites harder. Infection bites harder. Drought bites harder. Storm surges, wildfire, landslides, and cold snaps all bite harder because communities cannot turn rare catastrophe into stable cultural memory. What survives in the record suggests that even highly knowledgeable non-industrial peoples rely enormously on finely tuned transmitted tradition. Remove that tradition's linguistic backbone, and the environment becomes a far more dominant author of human fate. None of this means humans would be passive victims. They would still fight, adapt, improvise, and endure with astonishing tenacity. A species that can coordinate even modestly, carry tools, read one another's fear, and alter behavior from experiences already formidable. Some groups would become masters of narrow environments through long repetition. Coastal foragers might read tide and bird movement with breathtaking precision. Woodland groups might know nut cycles, spore, and hidden water better than any outsider could imagine. Cold country bands might learn shelter, fire, and movement patterns that preserve life through brutal seasons. But all such mastery remains local and fragile. It belongs to places and bodies more than to humanity as a whole. So nature never quite recedes into backdrop. It remains protagonist. Weather is not inconvenience but command. Disease is not misfortune but recurring erasure. Predators are not symbols but neighbours with teeth. Floods rewrite life without warning. Droughts strip communities down to movement and hunger. The sea gives, then kills. The forest shelters, then traps. Mountains hide water and death in equal measure. In our own world, language gradually allows humans to answer back with memory, law, ritual, engineering, science, and coordinated adaptation. In this world, the answer is quieter and shorter lived. People survive because they are human. They never dominate because language never arrives to gather their scattered victories into lasting force. The earth remains older, larger, and far less impressed. At some point, it becomes impossible not to wonder whether something else would rise to fill the gap. Human beings are too expressive, too social, too dependent on one another for the vacuum to remain completely empty. If full language never appears, would gesture grow denser? Would rhythm or music carry more structured meaning? Would marks, body patterns, or spatial symbols begin to substitute for speech? Could a species so close to symbolic thought invent some parallel system strong enough to escape the trap? It is a reasonable hope, and in this world it would likely be tested again and again. The body would keep reaching for a bridge. The question is whether any bridge short of language could bear the full weight of civilization. Gesture is the most obvious candidate because so much of early communication already depends on it. Great apes use gesture flexibly. Humans, even now, lean on it constantly, often without noticing, pointing, shaping space with the hands, directing attention with posture and gaze, miming actions, signaling emotion through movement. All of this remains available in a speechless world. Over many generations, such systems could become astonishingly rich. Families and bands might develop highly nuanced repertoires for common activities: hunting, food sharing, warning, courtship, childcare, and conflict. A hand turned one way could mean caution, another way invitation. Repeated movement patterns might become conventional. Facial expression might carry far more precision than modern people usually extract from it. Scholars still debate just how far purely gestural systems could evolve without accompanying speech, but there is little doubt they could become remarkably sophisticated within small familiar groups. Yet gesture has hard limits. It usually requires line of sight. It competes with the hands, which humans need constantly for carrying, making, climbing, digging, defending, and tending fire. It performs poorly in darkness, behind obstacles, across long distances, or when attention is divided. Most importantly, it struggles to preserve long chains of abstract reference without an equally rich symbolic grammar behind it. A gesture can show shape, direction, urgency, or action very effectively. It is much worse at carrying nested ideas, like if the herd moved east after the early winds, then the northern crossing may be better after 3 mornings, unless the water has risen near the reeds. Some of that can be approximated with elaborate pantomime, but approximation is not the same as durable, scalable language. Gesture could reduce the loss, it could not end it. Music and rhythm offer another possibility. Human beings are extraordinarily responsive to rhythm. Even infants synchronize attention to patterned sound. Work, ritual, and emotion in our own world are often stabilized through chant, song, and beat. Without language, perhaps patterned vocalization would become more central. Calls could vary in pitch, tempo, repetition, and intensity. Drumming or percussive signaling might carry information across distance. Distinct sequences could become associated with danger, gathering, mourning, or movement. Some non-human species already achieve quite a lot through patterned sound, and humans possess unusually fine control over breath and vocal expression, even before full language enters the picture. But here too the ceiling arrives quickly. Rhythmic systems are powerful for coordination and emotion, less powerful for open-ended explanation. A drum pattern can summon, it can alarm, it can perhaps differentiate broad situations. It cannot easily encode the endlessly recombinable detail that language can. Music excels at unifying feeling and timing. Civilization requires more than shared feeling and timing. It requires argument, category, law, planning, memory, negation, hypothetical reasoning, and detailed reference to things not present. A musical humanity might become hauntingly expressive. It would still remain trapped on the near side of abstraction. Visual symbols might seem more promising. Humans could mark trees, stones, shelters, bodies, or pathways. They could create repeated signs for danger, food, place, possession, or return. Over time, such marks might become more standardized. Body painting or scarification patterns might indicate group membership or status. Arrangements of objects could signal use, exclusion, or warning. Spatial symbolism could become far richer than in our world precisely because speech never assumes the burden. There is some logic to this. When one channel remains weak, others often compensate. A speechless species might become intensely visual in its social coding. Still, visual systems face the same underlying problem without language-like structure behind them. They remain thin. A mark can indicate a thing or an instruction only if a community shares and preserves the meaning. That preservation itself requires high-fidelity transmission. If the sign means poison water to one generation and avoid strangers to the next, its utility collapses. True writing succeeds because it rides on a pre-existing linguistic engine. It encodes a spoken system rich enough to generate unlimited meaning. In the absence of that engine, marks may proliferate without becoming a full substitute. What survives in the record from many human societies suggests that symbols become truly powerful when they are embedded in story, speech, ritual explanation, and social correction. Strip those away, and symbols drift. One might also imagine a humanity that becomes exceptionally good at reading context. Perhaps the solution is not richer signs, but richer minds for interpreting them. Individuals could become hyper-attuned to minute bodily cues, environmental patterns, and situational memory. They might infer more from less than modern humans can. This is plausible to a point. Evolution under such conditions could indeed favor greater sensitivity to gaze direction, muscle tension, movement sequence, and emotional nuance. Social cognition might become even more embodied. Learning by watching might become extraordinarily refined. Children might grow up reading adults with a precision later humans reserve for spoken instruction. Yet even this adaptation would not solve the core problem. Better inference is not the same as durable symbolic storage. It helps within familiar groups. It does very little for the absent, the dead, the unknown, or the future. Civilization depends on making meaning portable across all four. A system that works mainly by shared context remains powerful only where context is already thick. Once people move, die, disperse, or meet strangers, inference begins to fail. The evidence remains incomplete on the outer limits of nonverbal cognition, but no single explanation fully accounts for how a species could replace language's combinatorial power with pure sensitivity alone. Some modern humans provide a useful clue here, though only cautiously and never as a simple analogy. Signed languages used by deaf communities are full human languages. They prove that speech is not the essence of language. The hands, face, and body can absolutely carry grammar, abstraction, recursion, metaphor, and history when a true language exists. This is a crucial distinction. The thought experiment is not about humans who use gesture instead of voice. It is about humans who never invent language at all, whether vocal or signed. Signed languages succeed because they are languages' structured symbolic systems shared socially and transmitted with high fidelity. If such a system arose in this alternate world, then the world would no longer be one in which humans never created language. It would simply be one in which language took a different channel. That is why every substitute remains, in the end, a partial answer unless it becomes language in disguise. Dense gesture, useful but limited. Music powerful but too broad and emotional. Visual signs, helpful but unstable without grammar. Enhanced inference, adaptive but local. Shared routines, strong but brittle. None of them can fully replace the one feature that matters most, a generative symbolic system capable of referring to absent things, preserving exact distinctions, nesting ideas, and spreading across generations with enough stability to accumulate knowledge. Anything that truly achieves that is no longer a substitute. It is language. This reveals something important about language itself. It is not merely one tool among many. It is a threshold technology of mind. Fire changes what humans can eat and where they can sleep. Tools change what hands can do. Social bonding changes what groups can survive. Language changes what reality can be shared. Once that happens, entirely new forms of existence become possible law, myth, science, debt, prayer, mathematics, literature, bureaucracy, diplomacy, philosophy, and the inner narration of self across time. Remove it, and every other expressive channel strains under the missing weight. There would still be beauty in the substitutes. That's worth pausing over. A world without language might be one of astonishing bodily intelligence, of rich silence full of glances and rhythms modern people barely know how to notice. Groups might dance meaning into the night more vividly than any spoken people. Warning systems might be subtle and elegant. Shared labour might move with almost musical coordination. Body ornament and marking might carry emotional depth. Grief might be expressed in form so raw and immediate that later humans would find them overwhelming. The species would not become dull. It might, in some narrow respects, become exquisitely sensitive. But sensitivity is not enough to build continuity. A beautiful system can still fail to preserve a technical detail, a legal principle, a genealogical truth, a medicinal dose, or a warning that must survive centuries. The body is eloquent, but it is not an archive unless symbolism deepens. The eye is keen, but it cannot substitute for externalized memory. The drum can summon many bodies to one place. It cannot tell them what happened there long ago and why the same mistake must never be repeated. The mark on stone can warn only if generations keep its meaning alive. Without language, that chain frays too quickly. So the alternatives would appear, and some would flourish impressively. Humans would not stop inventing communication simply because speech in the full linguistic sense failed. They would build dense islands of shared understanding out of whatever channels remained open. But again and again, those islands would remain islands. They would not join into continents of thought. They could sustain intimacy, not civilization. They could preserve routine, not history. They could coordinate action, not abstract order. And that, in the end, is the answer to the hope that something else might replace language. Something else could help. Something else could deepen life. Nothing else, short of becoming language itself, could fully free humanity from the narrow present that has defined it from the beginning. Now the missing world begins to gather in full. It is no longer enough to describe what speechless humans can and cannot do in the hunt, in the family, in the camp, or in the face of danger. By this point, the larger absence has become visible almost everything later. Humans would call civilization has failed to come into existence. No cities rise above riverbanks. No kingdoms consolidate valleys. No fleets cross oceans under remembered commands. No schools preserve difficult skills beyond the lifespan of masters. No texts survive flood or fire. No calendars discipline the year into named time. No philosophical traditions argue across generations. No law extends beyond living enforcement. No science accumulates observation into theory. The future is not merely diminished. It has been thinned almost beyond recognition. The first and most obvious loss is the city. A city is not just a dense settlement. It is a concentration of strangers held together by shared systems they did not each witness being created. It depends on rules, records, professions, schedules, storage, trust mechanisms, political authority, and technical maintenance. A city survives because people can specialize without starving, because goods can move without every exchange requiring personal familiarity, because conflict can be managed by institutions rather than perpetual direct retaliation, and because memory lives outside the body in signs, stories, and records. Without language, none of those conditions stabilize. At most there are recurring gathering sites, rich camps, dense seasonal occupations, and clusters of shelters that persist for a time. But no place becomes the self-aware machine of continuity that a true city requires. With the city gone, everything built on the city disappears with it. There are no markets in the full sense, only exchanges, no temples in the full sense, only charged places, no courts, only reactions, no archives, only fading traces, no civic engineering, only repeated local repairs. The species never constructs streets lined with stored memory. It never builds walls whose meaning outlasts those who raised them. It never discovers what happens when thousands of minds are locked into a single system of food, water, labor, hierarchy, and belief. Some of the worst human misery therefore never appears. There are no urban famines on imperial scale, no bureaucratic tyrannies, no literate systems of conquest recording tribute from distant provinces, no crowded slums in the shadow of monuments. But this mercy is inseparable from a far greater deprivation. The human experiment in large-scale complexity never takes place. Science vanishes almost before it can be named. Observation remains, of course. A speechless humanity still watches the moon change. Tides turn, wounds rot, stars move, seeds sprout, carcasses decay, fires behave differently with dry and wet wood. Clouds gather before storms, insects rise before rain, and animals return by season. The raw material of science is everywhere because the world keeps presenting patterns, whether anyone formalizes them or not. But science depends on more than noticing. It requires persistent comparison, symbolic notation, shared critique, preserved procedure, and the ability to isolate cause from coincidence across time. A single observation may sharpen survival in the moment. Science begins when observations no longer die where they were first made. In this alternate world, they almost always do. That means no astronomy in the strong sense, though stars still burn overhead. People would still see patterns in the sky because human perception is made for pattern. They might orient by stars in some rough practical manner. They might notice recurring movements or phases. But there would be no named constellations preserved across peoples, no tracked solstices, no eclipse predictions, no zodiacal systems, no sky myths binding cosmic order to social order, no navigation traditions rich enough to span deep waters reliably. The night sky would remain beautiful and useful in fragments, never turned into a cumulative intellectual landscape. Medicine never becomes medicine either. There is care, habit, improvisation, and occasional insight, as earlier sections have shown. But there are no anatomies, no herbal corpuses, no surgical traditions transmitted in detail, no catalogues of symptoms, no theories of contagion, no experiments preserved in writing or teaching systems, no hospitals, no public sanitation regimes, no long memory of case comparison. Birth remains more dangerous. Injury remains more final. Infection remains more mysterious. Old age remains less protected by inherited practice. The evidence remains incomplete on how far practical healing could advance through pure demonstration and routine alone, but no single explanation fully accounts for sustained medical progress in the absence of language and symbolic storage. Healing would exist. Medicine as a cumulative body would not. Art becomes one of the most haunting absences because in some ways it would still be everywhere and nowhere at once. Humans would still decorate, arrange, dance, shape, and prefer certain forms over others. Beauty does not depend entirely on language. Rhythm does not depend entirely on language. Pattern certainly does not. But literature disappears completely, because literature is language remembered for more than utility. No epics, no poems, no dramas, no sacred recitations, no proverbs, no songs with semantic depth preserved across generations. Even visual art remains more local and fragile because criticism, style traditions, symbolic conventions, and interpretive communities never deepen. A mark on stone can be moving. A tradition of meaning around the mark is what turns art into civilization. That larger frame never fully forms. Philosophy vanishes in a quieter way. Human beings without language would still feel wonder, fear, confusion, sorrow, and perhaps a bodily form of existential unease. They would still stand beneath the stars and feel small. They would still see death and feel the rupture between movement and stillness. They would still experience choice, regret, affection, and dread. But philosophy requires questions that can be stabilized long enough to return to them. What is a good life? What is justice? What survives death? What makes one act different from another? Whether time repeats or flows, whether the self is continuous, whether cause and coincidence differ. These are not merely emotions. They are linguistic problems made durable by reflection. Without language, the human animal can feel the pressure of such questions without building traditions around them. And there are no empires, which means the map of the world remains almost empty of abstract power. Mountains, forests, rivers, coasts, deserts, and grasslands matter immensely. But they are not partitioned into states claiming authority far beyond the personal reach of any one leader. There are no tax systems extracting grain from villages, no roads built to move armies across provinces, no official religions tying distant communities together, no standardized weights, no courts of appeal, no bureaucrats, no imperial propaganda carved into stone. Again, this spares the species many forms of domination. It also erases many of the conditions under which infrastructure, long-distance exchange, and technical specialization historically flourished. The civilization that never was is therefore not simply kinder or simpler. It is shallower in almost every dimension of accumulated human possibility. One lesser-known truth about history is that many of humanity's greatest achievements are built on layers of invisible coordination so ordinary that later ages forget they are there. A bridge assumes measurement traditions, labor coordination, material knowledge, and authority structures. A law code assumes memory systems, scribal practice, political legitimacy, and shared categories of offense. A mathematical theorem assumes notation, teaching, prior proofs, and communities of correction. A seafaring tradition assumes route memory, vessel standards, weather knowledge, inherited trust, and often cosmological framing. Pull out language at the base of these layers, and the visible marvels disappear almost automatically. There is no isolated invention of civilization waiting elsewhere in the sequence. The missing element sits too close to the root. Even memory itself changes in scale. In our world, a child can inherit worlds never seen, stories of vanished peoples, names of dead relatives, accounts of wars, poems from centuries earlier, legal codes written by strangers, scientific models describing invisible forces, maps of continents, myths of creation, revolutions, saints, philosophers, disasters, discoveries. In this speechless world, inheritance remains painfully narrow. One inherits mostly bodies, habits, local roots, and emotional atmospheres. The dead do not accompany the living very far. The absent do not become instructors. Distant lands do not become mentally habitable. Humanity remains trapped in a present that extends only a little into both past and future. If one tries to picture the planet after tens of thousands of years under these conditions, the image is both familiar and alien. Humans are everywhere they can survive, perhaps across vast regions, perhaps even across multiple continents if slow dispersal and embodied root memory permit it. They are not weak. They are not simple in the sense of being empty-minded. They use fire, tools, gesture, local custom, and intense social intelligence to persist in climates that would kill most species. They alter landscapes in small ways. They hunt, gather, avoid, exchange, fight, flee, nurture, and mourn. Some places bear deep signs of repeated habitation. Some materials travel farther than one might expect. There are traces of almost culture wherever one looks, but nowhere does the curve bend upward into civilization's dense acceleration. The planet remains humanly inhabited and civilizationally unfinished. That unfinished quality would be visible even in the land. No ploughed fields stretching to the horizon, no irrigation grids glittering under sun, no quarry scars beside monumental walls, no ports crowded with masts, no roads like scars stitched across empires, no libraries, no observatories, no script-covered tombs, no coins, no chronicles, no archives, no schools, no theatres, no parliaments, no monasteries, no law courts, no workshops organised around documented craft, no universities. The earth would hold humans, but not human history in the form we know it. Time would pass. Generations would vanish. Innovation would flare and fade. The deep human conversation with itself would never become audible. And this is perhaps the strangest part of all. The civilization that never was would not feel missing to the people living without it. No one can mourn a library without the concept of a library. No one can dream of a republic, a theorem, an empire, or a novel without language to make such things imaginable. The loss is visible only from our side, because we know what language unlocked in the real world. We know that the same animal body once wandered through grass and woodland with only gesture and sound close at hand, and then, through one of history's most profound transformations, learned to externalize thought. From there came everything not automatically, not evenly, not without brutality, but truly. A speechless humanity remains at the edge of that opening forever. It has people. It has life. It never quite has a world. What language made human is not easy to see when one is born inside it. Words arrive so early, settle so deeply, and wrap themselves so tightly around memory that they begin to feel less like a human invention than part of weather. A child points, babbles, names, asks, refuses, remembers, imagines, and very quickly a world becomes layered with invisible structure. A stone is no longer only a thing that can be held. It becomes this stone, that stone, the stone from the river, the sharp one, a sacred one, the one grandmother used, the one needed tomorrow, the one traded last winter, the one in the story. Language does not simply label reality, it multiplies it. It turns raw experience into categories, categories into systems, systems into institutions, and institutions into civilizations that can survive the death of everyone who first built them. Remove that from humanity, and the species remains alive. Add it back, and something almost like a second creation occurs. This is why the earlier losses cut so deeply. They were never only about speech in the narrow sense. They were about what speech becomes once it is shared widely enough and faithfully enough to alter the architecture of collective life. Language stretches time. That may be its greatest power. It lets the dead remain active among the living through memory, law, warning, praise, blame, ritual, and story. It lets the unborn begin life on ground prepared by people they will never meet. It lets a mistake become lesson rather than repetition. It lets a season become calendar, a wound become medicine, a route become map, a conflict become law, a burial become ancestry, a shelter become village, a village become city, and a city become a civilization with enough memory to look backward and forward at once. Without language, earlier sections have shown, humans remain trapped close to the immediate. With language, the immediate becomes only the surface layer of a much larger existence. A person can stand by a river and be simultaneously present in several kinds of time: today's hunger, remembered flood, ancestral migration, next year's planting, a sacred story about the river's origin, a legal dispute over its use, a poem set on its banks, a child's lesson about its dangers, and a map describing where it flows beyond the horizon. The water is still water. Language makes it history, boundary, metaphor, livelihood, memory, and future. No other human tool does quite this much invisible work. It also changes cooperation at the deepest level. Before language, humans can cooperate through sight, routine, emotion, and imitation. After language, they can cooperate through abstraction. They can obey a rule even when the enforcer is absent because the rule itself has become socially real. They can trust a stranger because categories and institutions make the stranger legible. They can labor for projects they will never finish because stories and plans tie present effort to future benefit. They can support specialists, preserve technical knowledge, and build dense webs of dependency none of them fully understands alone. Civilization is made of this kind of cooperation, not just bodies together, but minds held in shared symbolic structures powerful enough to organize behavior across distance, time, and death. Language transforms the self as well. Earlier, the speechless human mind felt more immediate, more embodied, more local in time. With language, the self becomes narratable. A person becomes the one who did this, fears that, intends this, regrets that, belongs to these people, comes from this place, owes this debt, hopes for this future. That narratable self is not an illusion exactly, but it is an achievement. It allows continuity through change. It allows memory to become identity rather than scattered episodes. It allows moral reflection, because one can compare what happened with what should have happened. It allows philosophy, because one can return to a question, frame it differently, argue with others, inherit their answers, reject them, and begin again. A silent humanity would still feel. A linguistic humanity can also interpret its own feeling. That interpretation becomes culture in the larger sense. Culture is often mistaken for ornament songs, costumes, monuments, rituals, cuisine. But at root, culture is organized memory. It is the set of meanings a group can preserve and transmit beyond the present scene. Language is what gives that memory its reach. It stores practical knowledge, yes, but also values, identities, grief, hope, shame, beauty, taboo, and purpose through language. A society can remember not only how to make a net or tend a fire, but why a place matters, why a law exists, why one act is honorable and another disgraceful, why a people sees itself as chosen, cursed, ancient, wandering, superior, wounded, or free. This is dangerous as well as powerful. Language allows solidarity. It also allows ideology. It allows scripture and poetry, but also propaganda and hatred preserved across generations. The tool that makes human greatness possible also makes human catastrophe scalable. That duality matters. To say language made humanity what it is not to say it only improved things. Once symbols become durable, cruelty can become durable too. A speaking species can preserve grievance, justify hierarchy, sanctify conquest, and manufacture obedience through stories as easily as it preserves medicine, law, and tenderness. A speechless humanity loses civilization. It also loses empire. It loses literature. It also loses propaganda. It loses philosophy. It also loses dogma. It loses law. It also loses bureaucracy. The difference is not between innocence and corruption. It is between a species confined to the immediate and one powerful enough to organize invisible worlds for good and ill alike. Even so, the balance is unmistakable. What language unlocks far exceeds what any other human trait could have done alone. Intelligence matters, but intelligence without transmission burns out locally. Hands matter, but hands without shared instruction remain trapped in procedural islands. Sociality matters, but sociality without symbolism struggles to scale. Fire, tools, migration, emotion, memory, and imitation all set the stage. Language is what turns the stage into history. It converts adaptation into inheritance. It makes cumulative culture possible. Once cumulative culture begins, biological evolution is no longer the only engine shaping the species. Humans begin evolving culturally at extraordinary speed, building worlds of meaning faster than genes can track. That is why the archaeological record, once language-rich symbolic behavior and dense social transmission take hold, begins to look like a different planet compared with the long earlier stretches of relative stability. One lesser-known insight from cognitive science and anthropology is that language does not have to determine every thought to transform the whole ecology of thought. People can think visually, spatially, emotionally, procedurally. They can solve many problems without inner sentences, but once a community possesses language, the community becomes a kind of distributed mind. Different people can hold different pieces of a problem and still combine them. One remembers the root, another the season, another the law, another the ritual words, another the repair method, another the genealogy that determines obligation. Language makes the group more than a cluster of clever bodies. It makes it a memory system. Writing later magnifies that effect again, but the first revolution is already there in speech and shared symbolic structure. This is why the absence imagined throughout this script feels so immense. It is not just that humans without language would lack poetry or diplomacy or writing. They would lack the main bridge by which individual experience becomes species-level inheritance. They would keep paying for the same lessons. They would keep losing the dead too quickly. They would keep shrinking back toward local life every time complexity tried to rise. They would remain deeply human in body and emotion, and yet unable to become the historical force we know. Language did not simply help humans survive. It changed what survival could mean. It made it possible not merely to continue living, but to continue accumulating. And once that accumulation begins, the planet changes. Forests are named, mapped, cut, protected, sanctified, and mourned. Rivers are dammed, worshipped, polluted, crossed, and written about. Stars become calendars, omens, mathematics, navigation, and myth. The dead become ancestors, saints, villains, exemplars, and entries in archives. The future becomes planned, feared, promised, mortgaged, legislated, and imagined in forms no mute species could sustain. Human beings cease to live only in landscapes. They begin living in symbolic worlds layered over landscapes, and those symbolic worlds become powerful enough to outlast empires and reshape continents. So what would happen if humans never created language? They would remain close to what made them possible, and forever distant from what made them historical. But the reverse is the deeper truth. What happened because humans did create language is that a clever, vulnerable primate learned how to deposit thought outside the moment. From that came memory with depth, cooperation with scale, identity with narrative, and civilization with all its grandeur and damage. Language did not merely decorate the human condition, it remade it so completely that without it, most of what we call humanity would never have existed at all. The quiet returns at the end of all this, but now it feels different, not empty and not peaceful, more like the silence of a road never built, stretching across a landscape that still holds all the raw materials of history and yet never turns them into memory. Fires still burn in the dusk. Children still lean against warm bodies as night gathers around the edges of camp. Hands still shape stone, lift food, shield the young, and touch the dead with the same tenderness our own ancestors once knew. The world is still human in the oldest sense. It is full of need, attention, fear, endurance, and fleeting acts of care. But almost nothing lasts beyond the bodies that carry it. That may be the strangest image of all. Not a world without intelligence, not a world without feeling, a world without inheritance deep enough to become civilization. Every lesson remains close to the ground. Every discovery risks being buried with its discoverer. Every place is lived in, but rarely remembered in the full sense. The dead fade quickly, the future stays short, the species survives, but it survives in scattered pockets of skill and memory, never fully gathering itself into the long conversation that, in our world, became history. And so the rivers keep flowing through unnamed territories. The stars keep turning above minds that can admire them, fear them, even depend on them, but never quite build a lasting cosmos out of their patterns. Forests open and close, coastlines shift, storms erase campsites, bones disappear into soil. Generation follows generation with almost no deep archive behind it, as if humanity is forever waking into the same difficult morning, forced to learn again what should have been carried forward. In our own world, language changed that. It gave sound to memory, shape to thought, weight to promises, endurance to grief, and structure to imagination. It let the living keep company with the dead. It let strangers become allies, laws survive rulers, and fragile discoveries accumulate into something far greater than any one lifetime. Without it, human life would still be real, still vivid, still hard-won, but it would remain like smoke in cold air, visible for a moment, then gone. And perhaps that is the final image that lingers, somewhere in the fading light, beside a river crossed 1,000 times and never named. A small group settles for the night. Sparks rise, faces turn gold, then dark again. Beyond them lies a world of cities never built, books never written, songs never preserved, maps never drawn, histories never told. All of it possible, all of it silent.